We are in a park with two children building a sandcastle. The boy watches their work saying he thinks it's not right. He says that's not what he wanted and the girl ends up laughing at him. At that moment, an older boy appears and steps on the two children's sandcastle while taunting them. After stepping on the castle, he tells the two to go somewhere else, making the girl cry over the destroyed work. Then the boy who was with her stands up to respond to the bully. Our protagonist tells him to get off the sandcastle. But this makes the bully angry and he asks what he was saying. The boy shows his irritation, telling him to take his foot off his castle. Seeing the protagonist's face, the bully shrinks a bit while trying to look serious. At that moment, a foot appears in front of him, almost like a shadow. In an acrobatic move, the protagonist manages to land a kick on the bully's face. With that blow, the bully is knocked down hard. While the protagonist remains ready for a possible attack, the bully slowly gets up while cleaning his nose. Then he notices he's bleeding and gets even angrier with the boy. But instead of retaliating, he starts to cry, asking for help. This leaves the protagonist without reaction while his friend hides behind him for protection. A few minutes later, the bully returns with a bandage on his nose and his older brother asking if it was the boy who hit him. Our protagonist just stares at the older brother seriously, which annoys him for not getting an answer. The older brother tries to convince the boy to talk, but he just dodges. This irritates him even more, and the protagonist mentions he never learned martial arts. While the older brother insists on trying to touch the protagonist, he just dodges everything. When the protagonist notices a gap, he lands a kick between the older brother's legs, which scares the younger one. At that moment, the younger bully complains to the protagonist about what he did to his brother. Our protagonist mentions that even without knowing martial arts, he's always been a troublemaker. Although he didn't care about those childhood fights, remembering it only became a problem when he grew up. A few years later, the protagonist was attending 5th grade at Moon Elementary School. While going to school, he ends up being called by a group of high schoolers to an alley. The high school boy asks him to do them a favor while showing a very suspicious look. Then he puts his arm over the protagonist's shoulder, saying he too was once a student at Moon Elementary. So the high schooler starts pushing the protagonist into the alley where his friends were. One of his friends mocks the high schooler, Austin, saying he had a talent for it, while the girl in the group tells him to hurry up. The high schooler looks at him with an even more suspicious look, asking if he would help them. Our protagonist turns to him and asks what they want. This question starts to irritate the high schooler, who tells him to hand over all the money. Then the protagonist says that the high school students were so poor they needed to go get it from children. At this, the group starts to laugh at Austin for being provoked by the boy and say that the protagonist was angry. Austin loses his patience and tries to deal with the boy alone. But the protagonist shows he knows how to deal with people like him. After dodging a few times, the group starts to take an interest in it, with the girl saying she was rooting for the protagonist. Seeing that this could attract a lot of attention, the other boys decide to help Austin deal with him. At that moment, the protagonist lands a knee on Austin's chin. With Austin knocked down, the protagonist faces the rest of the group, waiting to see their response. A second boy approaches, hitting him with a punch in the face, making him be dragged across the ground with the impact. A second high schooler shows irritation with the protagonist and decides to teach him a lesson. But the protagonist says he never felt fear or thought about what would happen after, as he picks up a brick from the ground. He says he knew exactly how to react, and then he uses the brick and hits the high schooler hard on the head. With two knocked down, the other members of the group are speechless while staring at the protagonist. Their leader, Austin, whom they believe would be the school leader, was knocked out with his head bleeding. This causes the others to lose their heads and go after the protagonist for revenge. But he advances against them with the brick, saying he believes he was born this way and that he never loses in a fight. The girl in the group is in shock while someone trembles beside her, begging for help, seeing everyone being knocked down by the protagonist. His brick in hand was completely stained with blood from his attacks. When the protagonist turns to the girl to find out what she intended to do, he looks at her in a frightening way. A few minutes later, at the police station, the officer asks if he was really serious that he had done all this. But the boy just remains quiet, leaving the officer waiting for some answer. At that moment, a woman arrives in the room with a coat and panting while calling for her son Seth. She apologizes to the officer while he just says it was all right, still awkward about the situation. After that, the two leave the police station without saying anything, with the woman watching her son. She asks if he was hurt, and he shakes his head no. Then she bends down to talk to Seth, asking him to promise one thing, which confuses him. His mother asks him to promise that he would no longer fight with anyone. Seth nods, agreeing, saying he had no other choice because he didn't want to see that sadness in her eyes anymore. She thanks Seth for the promise, but he remembers that at the time he didn't know the truth behind that sadness. Time passes and Seth arrives at high school, still having the same determined expression from that time. A boy opens the door with all his might while calling for Seth, clearly looking for a fight. Then he invades the room and lands a kick on Seth's back while asking if Seth thinks he's funny. With that kick, he ends up being thrown against the wall. The boy tells Seth to just obey him, and if he needs money to give to him, to ask someone else. Seth gets angry and thinks about retaliating, but he hesitates and simply apologizes. But then the boy throws his head to the ground and tells him not to do that again. He even says that he should be careful, especially near him, if he doesn't want to have problems. After the boy gives that warning, he leaves the room while surrounded by his friends who watch Seth laughing at him. Our protagonist clenches his fist while trembling with anger until he takes a deep breath and just says he did well in not reacting. Upon arriving home, his mother observes him and notices something. She works at a restaurant asking him how school was, and he just says it was great. He asks how the restaurant is doing, and she says it's going very well. Seth says all he wished for was to see the smile on his mother's face, no matter what happened. But at that moment, a black car appears on the street in front of the restaurant. As they go out to check what was happening, they notice there were several cars and some men got out of them. These men appear with a funeral photo saying that man had passed away, which shocks his mother. Seth is startled seeing his mother collapsing and asks what was happening. He looks back at the photo and remembers that on that day, something had happened to them. Years pass, and we see Youngjin High School where there were rumors of a new student and the others were curious about it. As the student approached the classroom, the teacher mentions the transfer student and asks for help with him. At that moment, the student arrives in the classroom and introduces himself as Seth Kang. The girls stare at him, noticing he was quite handsome, while one of them seemed to recognize that name. But with the continuous murmurs, the teacher gets irritated and tells everyone to be quiet. The boys at the back of the room already observe him with malicious laughter, until one of the boys ends up noticing something and his friend asks what happened. This boy recognizes Seth too and believes it was a big coincidence. Seth introduces himself to the class, and the teacher tells him to sit on the empty bench at the back. Then he approaches his desk and sits next to the spiky-haired boy who was sleeping. As he looks to the side, he notices the boy staring at him with the same malicious smile as before. He decides to give a friendly smile as he recognizes the boys, noting that they also went to that high school. During the break, one of the boys approaches Seth and mentions they were sad when transferred in high school. The boys start to surround him, saying they're going to have a great school year. But Seth gives a smile that irritates the boy and asks if he doesn't remember who he was. Our protagonist says he couldn't possibly forget who he was while showing an empty and dead smile. That face scares the boy, and his friend gets angry with Seth asking if he was crazy. At that moment, the sleeping boy simply tells everyone to be quiet. He lifts his face a bit, asking if they didn't see that he wants to sleep while showing a stressed look. This scares the boy even more, who just apologizes to him. After avoiding a fight with the sleepy boy, the bully stands up saying he hasn't finished the conversation with the protagonist. Seth turns to his sleeping classmate, not understanding. The teacher opens the door trembling as he was a very old man and moves slowly to the desk. He tries to start the class until he gets confused and forgets what the planned lesson was for that day. Meanwhile, the boy continues to be outraged, thinking about Seth managing to leave him without an answer and already plans to take revenge on him. When he turns to Seth, he is staring at the window next to his sleepy classmate. Seth observes the weather of that day with a slight smile, while in the distance one of the girls was watching him. The girl believes this is the same boy she met when she was younger. But the moment he looks at her, she gets startled and turns away. He gets confused, wondering if she also knew him. But soon he ignores it and goes back to staring at the window, thinking it might be fun. After a while, he feels so relaxed that he starts to get sleepy. At the moment the spiky-haired boy is awake, Seth collapses from sleep under the table. The blonde boy stares at the protagonist and decides to leave the room for a moment. Then the bullies, who are watching him with fear, are impressed, until they understand it would be a chance to go talk to Seth, who was sleeping. With it, the bully joins his friends and goes to the table to settle the score with him. But at that moment, someone comes to stop them. The girl who had recognized him stands in front of the boys to prevent them from approaching Seth. This irritates the bully, saying it's going to be her turn too, but the girl says they can't cause trouble in the classroom. He says he doesn't care about that and tells her to get out of the way. But she doesn't hesitate, saying that as the class representative, she wouldn't let them do whatever they want. At that moment, Seth's hand appears on her shoulder, saying that although he appreciates the help, he prefers that she step aside. Our protagonist refers to them as his high school friends. He asks if they missed him because he missed those classmates while showing excitement for a fight. While the representative watches him curiously, the protagonist begins to explain about his life, saying that he held back when he was younger because of his mother, and with that the bully already notices something different. But he also remembers his father's words, saying he shouldn't let anyone kick his behind. A few minutes later, the blonde boy returns to the classroom and notices something different there. He realizes the bullies were no longer there and goes back to sit, while Seth seemed to have gone back to sleep. The class representative tries to look at Seth without turning her face, while the blonde boy lowers his head and goes back to sleep too. Then she turns to the protagonist, who slept like a fool. Meanwhile, a boy asks the bullies about them losing to a transfer student. This boy is intimidating and stares at them with superiority while trying to confirm their story, asking for help. The bully had a bandage on his nose while saying he used to be weak in high school. But something changed in him, and with that he remembers how Seth knocked them all down with a single blow. The big guy complains to the bully Nathan, saying he should be ashamed of losing to a weakling. Then the big guy heads to their classroom and looks through the window, asking if the transfer student was there. With that, he opens the door, with everything already starting a speech for the classroom, wanting to know who the new student is. The representative gets startled to see who it was this time, and he already starts trying to guess who it would be. Nathan mentions it was the boy next to Victor, while the protagonist continues to sleep. Then he says he will give his welcome to the newcomer. As he approaches, the classmate of the representative wonders why he was there. Despite the big guy trying to talk to Seth, he doesn't respond, which irritates him even more. Seth lifts his head, still sleepy, and the big guy says he took care of his money source. The big guy introduces himself as Goblin from Jungsan High School and says you must have heard something about him. At that moment, Goblin starts to look closely at Seth's face, realizing it was familiar and wonders if they've seen each other before. Our protagonist asks what he's talking about, and then the two recognize each other. It turns out that Goblin from Jungsan was the bully who destroyed his sandcastle when he was a child. Remembering this, Seth gets excited, asking how he's been and how his brother was. But he doesn't realize how much Goblin was sweating cold remembering his face. Trying to stay firm, he just says he'll see him later. Seth smiles, saying it's all good as Goblin leaves the room being questioned by Nathan. The bully tries to force Goblin to solve his problem with Seth until he sees the big guy's face again telling him to move. Nathan doesn't understand anything and asks if he wasn't going to solve the case, but Goblin reinforces that he should get out of the way. With that, Goblin walks out of the room and Nathan just looks confused and turns to face Seth, not understanding anything. Seth feels at home returning to his old neighborhood until they realize something. Both he and the representative have a slight premonition while Goblin makes a call to his older brother. Back at Seth's mother's restaurant, she asks how school was going. He says it was fun, and she already asks about their promise. Seth says he remembers he shouldn't fight anyone unless they hit him first. His mother already shows concern, and he says he would leave because he had class that day. But as he leaves the place, he is greeted by a man calling him boss. At that moment, he sighs, reminding the guy that he wasn't supposed to do that, and he had already asked him to stop. The man calls him boss again, and the protagonist repeats that he stopped calling him that. After getting into the car, he asks to go quickly, and the driver continues the journey while his mother watches them. Back at school, Seth is sleeping in the classroom next to Victor. Hours pass, and so do classes, while Seth just lies on the table sleeping and the representative stares at him. While the boys talk nonsense in the room, the physical education teacher opens the door. Then the representative tells everyone to stand up for the teacher. He goes to the desk already without much enthusiasm and notices something in the room. The two sleeping in the back end up annoying him while the students get worried. With that, the teacher goes to the back of the room very angry and stops behind the two. At that moment, he pulls both of their ears and lifts them to wake them up. The teacher starts complaining to Victor, saying he only let go last time because he was busy with other things. As for Seth, the teacher doesn't recognize him and asks who he would be. That the representative raises her hand, explaining that Seth was the transfer student. But since they were sleeping in class, the teacher sends both to the running field. On the running field, the two look around while complaining about having to do this. He explains that the two would have to run 3 laps around the field, but he includes that the first to cross the finish line wouldn't be punished for their behavior that day, while the loser would regret being born, but the two continue without any enthusiasm. As the teacher ends up shouting, demanding an answer, Seth accepts his orders. Then Victor starts running, and the teacher already hurries Seth for not running yet. At first, he runs without any enthusiasm or concern, until he mentions it would be embarrassing to lose, and with that, Victor gets excited to run. Victor starts to speed up, and Seth manages to keep up. But Victor accelerates even more, hoping to leave him behind, which disturbs Seth. Understanding that this would be a contest, he gets excited about the idea. And with that, the two run like a bullet past the teacher. He is impressed to see the absurd disposition of Seth and Victor. The two race across the running field while looking at each other like two children trying to overtake the other. After finishing the race, both are exhausted, and Victor looks at Seth curiously, while Seth imagines it will be fun. Meanwhile, the teacher continues to be impressed to see that someone could reach Victor's level. The next day, the final round of the national team fighting selection contest was taking place. In the open weight category, a blonde man boasts that he was close to joining the team as he only lacked one more opponent. But his opponent was a huge boy who looks at him from behind with a strange aura. All the spectators are worried about it, while the boy seems to be annoyed by the man's comment, because even though he talked so much, he didn't last in the fight and was already defeated by him. After the fight, competitor Brock Chang returns to his locker room to rest, until he receives a visit from Goblin and asks what he was doing there. Goblin says that the boy from the past who beat them when they were younger was back. This phrase makes Brock scared and starts shaking sitting down, which makes his brother curious. Back at school, Seth and Victor were sent to the counseling room by the teacher, who tells them not to sleep in his class. Then he already asks Victor when his next competition would be. He says he hadn't registered, and the teacher explains that if he wants to be a professional, he should also pay attention to weight. Then he turns to Seth and asks if he's on any team. As Seth doesn't understand, he explains it's about athletic teams, and Seth says he's not participating in any. His phrase disappoints the teacher for the wasted potential before sending them back to the classroom. Arriving in the classroom, the elderly teacher tells them to sit in their places. The two look at the teacher just before lying down, and while looking at each other, they fall asleep again. At the end of the afternoon that day, Brock goes to the school to try to find Seth, wondering why right in that place. At that moment, everyone starts to spread that Brock was back at school and keeps all the boys attentive to it. He goes to the student council room where the president asks if he came back again. Meanwhile, in Seth's room, he continues to sleep and Victor is already getting up to leave. Victor starts to run until he passes by Brock, calling him Broomhead, asking where his class was. But as he ignores him, Brock grabs his shirt, forcing Victor to answer. Then he warns that if he didn't let go, he would have problems. Brock starts to laugh, asking if he doesn't know who he was. But Victor admits he has no idea who he was, and this irritates Brock. At that moment, Victor lands a punch on the chin to make him let go of his shirt. With that, he already strings together a series of punches against his opponent. But Brock stretches out his hand, going after his neck. Brock starts pressing Victor while holding him, asking if that was all he could do. He acknowledges that Victor had potential while holding him, but he introduces himself by saying he will finish him off unless someone reprimands him. As he turns around, he notices the PE teacher nearby and asks if he was fighting again. Steph sees the fight happening as he leaves and wonders what was going on at that school, even without knowing it was because of him. Meanwhile, in the student council room, they are organizing a meeting. President Jason Chin starts by saying they know why they are gathered. He explains that Brock is back, and even though they don't know the reason, he will cause trouble. He introduces Brock as the national wrestling representative and Victor as the featherweight boxing champion. He goes on to say that the fight between the two was stopped by the PE teacher. One of the council members asks why Brock returned and imagines he just wants to cause more trouble. This member was the Taekwondo club captain, Gabe Yu, who wonders if Brock shouldn't be preparing for nationals. However, someone responds that this is his school too, so he doesn't need a reason. But Gabe asks if they are saying that Brock missed the school. Jason asks Sam if he knows anything about Brock's return since they've known each other since they were kids. Sam mentions that Brock said something about fetching the new kid, even though he doesn't know why. This leaves Jason confused about Brock's motivations as the meeting continues. At that moment, Seth is leaving school to go home. He notices a black car parked and finds his driver sleeping while waiting for him. After waking him up and teasing him, they head home, observed by the class representative, Sophie. She notices Seth in the car while her friend calls her from afar. The driver asks if Seth is going to visit a place again, and he confirms. That night, they pass by his mother's restaurant, and Seth watches her working, then tells the driver to keep going. They arrive at the building of a company called Sunshine Group. At the entrance, he is greeted by a man who welcomes him as the boss. Seth gets out of the car, greeted by his employees at the entrance of the building. He gets irritated and asks how many times he needs to repeat not to call him boss when he's in his school uniform. This leads to a flashback of the protagonist in front of his father's grave on a rainy day. He stares at the photo on the grave until a tall man appears with an umbrella, asking them to leave because it was getting cold. Our protagonist asks what kind of person his father was. The man replies that his father became the strongest in all of Korea with nothing but his fists. Seth asked about his mother and why he was never around. The man mentions that his older brother always took care of him. He explains that sometimes his father would leave work just to see him. While Seth is impressed by this revelation, his uncle mentions his father's last words. He said not to let anyone kick his butt because it was shameful. They recall watching from afar as Seth was bullied by his schoolmates. Back at the school, President Jason goes to the protagonist's classroom with his partners and tells them to wait outside. When he enters the room, he immediately notices the two troublemakers sleeping while the rest of the students are worried about his visit. Sophie is impressed by the president's visit, while her friend thinks it would be a good idea to change classrooms. Jason greets Sophie, and when she asks what he is doing there, he asks who the new student is. She asks if he did something wrong, and Jason explains that he just wants to ask some questions. At that moment, Seth wakes up making a lot of noise, catching their attention. As soon as Seth faces the president, he is called to the student council room. But he asks who he is, making Sophie worried before explaining about Jason. Our protagonist thanks him for the visit and asks if they can talk right there. Jason begins to lose his patience with him and simply asks him to follow along with Victor before leaving the room. Sophie says the president is a nice guy and asks him to just do what he says. Right after, he nudges Victor to wake him up and explains what happened. Upon hearing this, Victor jumps up, knocking over his chair, wondering what was happening to everyone. He heads to the council room and Seth asks Victor to wait for him. Then he notices the class representative watching him. To calm her down, he gives a slight smile, saying he'd be right back while following Victor. In the council room, Victor drags the chair he brought. After arranging it, he sits down, asking why he was called to that room. Jason adjusts his glasses and gets straight to the point, asking if he knows who Brock Chang is. Both of them are confused until Victor starts to remember the fight with the guy from the previous day. Jason explains that until 2 years ago, this school was for athletes. The government sent the most talented athletes from all over the country to study there. Victor asks why he was there if everyone knows this story, although the protagonist has no idea about it. Jason continues, explaining that currently it's just an ordinary school because of Brock, who caused many problems until he left. But now Brock is back to find the new kid, which makes everyone curious. The president asks what their relationship is, and Seth stays silent for a moment. He admits that he has no idea who Brock Chang is, which leaves everyone even more confused. Meanwhile, in the counseling room, the teacher talks to Brock, saying he heard he was on the national team. He asks why Brock doesn't seem happy since he thought that was his dream. Brock simply stands up and says he's leaving while the teacher calls him for a final piece of advice. The teacher tells him never to give up on sports no matter what happens, but Brock just stares at him and leaves the room, letting the door close behind him. Back in the student council room, Jason explains what happened during Brock's time, saying several students were suspended. When he arrived to see what was going on, it was too late because Brock had taken down several students and faced Jason all bloody. Many students had athletic careers and were forced to abandon them, while Brock was nearly sent to juvenile detention and expelled. He explains that a judo team member was going to the national team but was stopped by what happened. After this incident, the school was abandoned by sponsors and became an ordinary school, with the clubs remaining intact. Jason mentions that the one who helped Brock was the teacher, preventing him from being punished and introducing him to a team. While Seth starts to tire of the story, the president again mentions that he came back because of him. Victor begins to get irritated, looking at Seth curiously about this, while the protagonist continues to understand nothing. At the end of the day, the two are leaving school while the representative waits for them outside. Our protagonist notices her there waiting, and Victor ends up giving a teasing smile. Sophie asks if he's okay, and Seth confirms, which makes Victor exit the scene wishing him good luck. Steph continues to be confused about it while Victor says goodbye to both. He asks if Sophie was waiting for him, leaving her without an answer. Then she puts her bag in front of her face, trying to formulate a phrase, and Seth continues not to understand, until she asks if he remembers her while trying to look at him directly again. But he responds that she is the class representative, which irritates her. Sophie tries to help, asking if he remembers when they were little, and he says he knew. Steph mentions that he remembers her from spring daycare and that they were very close friends at the time. The representative gives a slight smile while Seth continues talking about how they used to play a lot at his house, which makes her smile. They remember various moments together, from playing in the trees to her kissing his face. Then he says she doesn't need to worry because he wouldn't tell anyone she kissed him while pointing to his face. Steph explains that they were children, but then she becomes quite disheartened while he asks if she waited so long just to ask that. At that moment, the student council members start to leave, and she complains, asking who said she was waiting for him. She follows the president and leaves with the council members, leaving Seth alone. Seeing the two talking, the protagonist believes they get along very well and just smiles. As he goes the opposite way, he remembers when they were children. Our protagonist smiles as he continues on his way until he sees the car for his ride stopped again. He finds his driver sleeping again and starts to get into the car until he is greeted by the still sleeping driver. Then, when he asks why he is always so nervous, the driver wakes up, apologizing. Again, he asks if he should pass by his mother's restaurant so he can see her. Seth says no and asks them to go straight to the company. Arriving at the Sunshine Group building in the president's office, he shows boredom with the paperwork. He starts to shuffle through the papers, asking what he should know about these matters. But his uncle asks him to speak more professionally when at work. The two stare at each other, and the protagonist asks if he really needs to do this since he's not officially the president yet. However, his uncle reminds him that the Sunshine Group is the product of his father's work, and as the only son, he should inherit it. Our protagonist says he's only 17 and doesn't know much about these things. With that, his uncle gets irritated, saying that Sunshine is not an average corporation. He mentions that the roots of Sunshine are what people call gangs, explaining that they only appear legitimate. Their company handles numerous illegal businesses that have arisen in the underworld in every possible sector. His uncle calms him, acknowledging that he still has 2 more years before he truly takes over the business. But he already advances that this means nothing for the business because he is the son of the boss whom all the executives have accepted. Our protagonist sighs until they receive a call. Then Seth's uncle answers the call, and someone says that the people from Busan were there, but the call is dropped. He gets deeply irritated until a door is kicked open, and the uncle asks what they think they were doing. At that moment, the boss of the Busan group, Derek Paik, invades the room, asking if he wasn't welcome there. While the uncle says that it was betrayal, Derek responds angrily that he doesn't accept Seth in power because he's just a boy. His attitude irritates the uncle so much that he needs to be stopped by Seth, who intervenes in the conversation between the two. Our protagonist stares at him and asks how Derek's nose was with that. He replies that he was careless last time, and Seth asks if he would like a rematch. This excites the protagonist, saying it was the perfect time because he was in a very bad mood, and he jumps on Derek. Derek can't react while the protagonist approaches him, and then a noise of something being crushed is heard. The next day back at school, Seth says goodbye to the driver while Jason watches him arriving at school. The two stare at each other, and Seth enters through the gate while they remain alert to Brock. Meanwhile, Brock orders his brother to bring the protagonist by any means, and then Jason notices him from afar watching the entrance. In the council room, the president explains the situation and asks them to avoid fights with Brock. Gabe gets irritated by this, asking who he thinks he is and why they should be careful with him. Sam explains that since Brock is a national representative, he has no reason to fight with them. But this only irritates Gabe even more because the current situation of the school is his fault. The president puts an end to the discussion, saying they couldn't do anything about it. This phrase makes Gabe lose his head, remembering that they all went there because it was an athlete's school that lost everything because of him. Everyone acknowledges that it was true, although they can't do much about it. Gabe gets furious and kicks the chair, complaining that he needs to recover what Brock took from him and that he would do it at all costs. Meanwhile, Goblin goes to Seth's room and finds him sleeping again. Very carefully, he wakes him up, calling him to talk outside the room. Seth says he's sleepy and Goblin says it's important, which makes the protagonist agree and go with him. Our protagonist asks if he wants to talk outside, and he confirms while Victor watches the two leaving the room. As they leave through the corridors, Sophie worries about what will happen. Back in the schoolyard, Brock is bored after defeating all the students Gabe called to help him. Brock asks if that was all they had, and Gabe gets angry with him. The athlete delivers a kick against Brock, who blocks with his arm. But at that moment, Brock grabs his leg, saying he hopes he has said his prayers. Then he pulls Gabe by the leg and throws him hard against the ground. After defeating him, he still feels bored while observing his unconscious body on the ground. Then he says he will make sure he never walks again. However, he is stopped by the council president, who appears to end the fight. Brock recognizes him, and Jason asks why he was there since he had no grudge against the school. He explains that he indeed had no problems with the school and just wanted to talk to the new kid. Jason tells him not to cause any more disorder within the school area. With that, Brock says that although nothing can scare Jason because he comes from a wealthy family and is the council president, he is superior. The president stands firm, saying that he cannot let the entire school get into trouble because of him. Suddenly, our protagonist arrives, brought in by Goblin. At that moment, the two stare at each other and Seth realizes that he is the Brock they talked so much about. Remembering Goblin's brother's face, he gives a huge smile, saying he hasn't changed a bit. But then Brock is ready to face him and approaches the protagonist. Seth notices his intentions and starts to tremble his hands until he clenches them, preparing his fist. Until Jason intervenes between the two, preventing Brock's advance. He warns Jason not to interfere if he doesn't want to regret it. However, the president remains firm in his decision, ordering them not to fight at school. Brock finally loses patience with the president and decides to attack him. With that, Seth asks Jason to get out of his way while pushing him aside. Our protagonist believes he came to see him while the two remain unresponsive to his attitude. Jason tries to threaten Seth so they don't cause more problems for the school, and the protagonist assures that he won't let anything happen. He asks to go fight in the gym as there were many people there. He also mentions that they can choose any form of fight they want because he doesn't care. Brock remains silent, staring at him, and Seth says he's not afraid of him. Then Brock raises his hand to attack him, and Seth asks if he looks like someone who is afraid of a fight. His look surprises both spectators until Seth says they will fight as sportsmen and asks where the gym is. With that, rumors of a fight begin to spread throughout the school, saying it would take place near the boxing club. In the boxing ring, the two face each other while waiting for the fight to start. Seth begins to stretch while smiling at Brock, and Brock takes off his shirt, warming up his arms. Then the council girl approaches Jason and starts to provoke, asking if he wasn't going to resolve this. In the gym's upper bleachers, Nathan is surprised to see the fight about to start. But then the physical education teacher appears, shouting at everyone. Everyone worries about what will happen, and the council girl starts to blame Jason for it. However, upon reaching the ring, the teacher just leaves a pair of gloves for Seth and says they need them for the fight. He mentions that he will be a referee and that they would fight under MMA rules with 3 rounds and 3 minutes per round. Seth observes the teacher and lets out a confident smile. Meanwhile, in the classroom, a boy bursts in shouting that they would be fighting in the boxing gym. At that moment, Sophie worries about it while Victor wakes up hearing Brock's name. Both stare at each other seriously until the teacher reminds them that this is a sport. Our protagonist decides to ask Brock if all this was because he was knocked down by him as a child and calls him a sore loser. But this only makes Brock even more impatient with him. Brock explains that was the only time he lost a fight and asks if that's reason enough for him. The teacher sounds the gong, and with that, the fight begins. Brock tries to grab Seth's face, who dodges but notices something in that movement. Then Seth grabs Brock's arm, already preparing his strike. He lands a knee against Brock's belly while lowering him by holding his neck. After being knocked down, he tries to get up with much effort and difficulty breathing. But Seth doesn't hold back and lands a blow against his neck to knock him down again. All spectators are impressed with what they just saw while Seth remains standing after defeating Brock. Our protagonist turns to the teacher and asks if he isn't going to start the count. But he hears that there's no need to rush, which worries Seth. When he turns around, he sees Brock trying to get up and almost standing. Brock manages to stand up completely out of breath while staring at Seth. This makes the audience go crazy because the fight was just beginning. At that moment, the class representative arrives at the gym while Seth watches his opponent. The big guy charges at Seth, who just sighs, saying he should have stayed down. In a quick move, he dodges Brock's attack and grabs his head. Then he pulls him back, throwing him with all of his strength to the ground. Seth positions himself over him, asking if he seems weak while preparing a direct punch to the face. Brock only has time to realize what is going to happen before his face is crushed by Seth's punch. Everyone is shocked by this while Seth continues to beat his face until the point the teacher orders to stop the fight. After Seth stops his sequence of punches, the place is all stained with blood and the protagonist asks again if he seems weak. In the Sunshine Hospital, Brock is being treated, all bandaged up and resting after the fight. Suddenly, he wakes up with a physical education teacher beside him watching. The teacher asks if he's awake and mentions that the diagnosis says he needs to rest for 2 months. It was explained that although they managed to fix his nose, he had a skull fracture and a broken rib. He also warns Brock that he talked to his team saying he suffered an injury during training. When he's more relaxed, the teacher complains to Brock about causing all this trouble over a childhood fight. But then Brock says he doesn't care about that because he found something much more interesting than wrestling. Back at school, all the students in the classroom tense up at Seth's presence. Seth sighs, making the boys even more worried while he just gets up from his place. Observing the corridor, he notices the fear stamped on everyone there, worried about his next action. Arriving at the bathroom, he finds a group of boys discussing what was happening. One of them explains that all this is because the new kid defeated Brock and his friend can't believe it, until the two classmates get worried looking at the bathroom entrance. Seth approaches them and kindly asks them to move aside a bit. At that moment, they get rid of their cigarettes and leave immediately. Victor enters the bathroom and stops next to Seth, asking if he's free after school. He turns angrily to Seth, saying that Brock was his target and calls the protagonist for a fight in the boxing ring alone. That night at school, Victor waits in front of the boxing ring for Seth. Throwing his things under the ring, he pulls boxing gloves from his backpack. He remembers how he was humiliatingly defeated by Brock and how Seth finished him off as if it were nothing. Victor gets angry with himself, realizing he was afraid of Brock. Hours pass and Seth doesn't show up, which further irritates Victor, who continues to wait for him. Meanwhile, at the Sunshine Group building, Seth is trapped with piles of documents. He tries to get out of it, saying he has to meet a friend. But his uncle says he can't, and Seth explains that his friend is waiting for him. Still, this uncle insists he can't go, and Seth just looks at him, disheartened. The next day, Victor is firm in his intense boxing training at the gym. He continues his training until a man comes up, asking him not to push himself too hard since he doesn't have an upcoming fight. Victor replies that he needs to be always ready for when he needs to be. The man tries to explain to him that boxing won't yield much and it would be worth more for him to switch to MMA. But Victor explains that he doesn't do it for the money, which leaves the man speechless. He says it's okay, and that he made a promise. The promise that he would become a world champion and that he wouldn't give up until he achieved it. After that, he tries to calm the man down, saying they should get a fight soon and heads to school. As Victor leaves the gym building, a black car appears. Several men get out of the car and talk to the man, asking him to sell the building, saying they will pay what it's worth. Arriving at school, Victor goes to his classroom and finds Seth lying on the table. Seeing him, Victor gets irritated, remembering Seth and Brock's fight the day before. He kicks Seth's chair, making him get up all sleepy. When he looks at the clock, he complains that it's not even 7 o'clock yet. Seth turns around and sees Victor behind him, complaining if he thought it was funny to have left him waiting. But he explains that he had a lot of work to do, and that's why he didn't show up. Victor is confused by this work story, and Seth just yawns from tiredness. He tries to threaten Seth in case he thinks of running away from him again that day. But then the protagonist gets excited as he stands up, asking why he thinks he arrived so early at school. Our protagonist explains that he's not the type of person who runs away when someone challenges him to a fight. This statement irritates Victor, who already cracks his knuckles in anger. With that, Victor charges at him and tries to land a punch on Seth's face. Our little monster doesn't move, letting the punch hit him in the face. Victor hears the protagonist say he doesn't feel bad about it and realizes what really happened. The protagonist caught Victor's punch with one hand, saying his punch is quite strong. But then he starts to squeeze his fist until he breaks one of the fingers. Even in pain, Victor continues to stare at him seriously, and Seth asks if he still intends to continue. At that moment, Victor prepares a punch with his other fist to knock Seth down. But all his punches are dodged until he corners himself against the wall. Victor charges at him, taking advantage of the situation, and prepares a direct punch to the protagonist's face. But Seth simply slaps his fist down, dropping Victor's arm, which impresses him. Trying to continue the attack, Victor prepares his other fist to strike. Our protagonist gets tired of being on the defensive and goes on the attack, until a boy arrives in the classroom and is shocked by what he sees. At that moment, Seth was almost being hit by Victor while he was about to land a punch on him. When Victor notices the student behind them, he decides it would be better to leave it for later. During classes, everyone looks at the two curiously about what happened earlier. The two have a sullen face throughout the class. Hours pass, and they continue trying to avoid looking at each other, until Sophie arrives calling Seth to go to lunch. At that moment, he feels excited, saying they can go together, which confuses her. Victor sits down and complains about him, saying they will soon find out who will win. But then he lowers his head and goes back to sleep on the table. When the two return, they see Victor sleeping and Seth lies down to sleep as well, while Sophie goes to her desk. At the end of the day, Victor gets up from the table and calls Seth to follow him. As they leave the school premises, he continues to tell him to follow, and Seth tries to ask something until Victor interrupts him. Still, he asks if they have arrived, and then Victor turns around just to see him entering a black car. Seth says he doesn't have much time and tells him to get in the car. After they get into the car, the driver asks, all uncomfortable, where he should take them. That night, the driver lights his cigarette to wait in front of Victor's boxing gym, asking if he can go home. At that moment, the black car returns, and the men who came in the morning come back armed. They walk towards the gym while the driver just smokes his cigarette. Meanwhile, inside the gym, Victor calls Seth to the ring. Then Seth looks to the side and sees a photo hanging on the wall of a fighter with a child. But Victor gets impatient and tells him to hurry up since Seth said he was busy. When Seth enters the ring, Victor admits he's been interested in him since he was transferred. Our protagonist still teases his opponent, asking how he managed to see him if he was sleeping. Victor gets irritated by his comment, and Seth tells him to just hand over the gloves. With that, Victor explains that this time he will fight without gloves because this is his sport. The two stare at each other seriously, and Seth pulls his tie to take off his shirt. At that moment, Victor is impressed to see the number of scars on Seth's body. He continues to provoke Victor, asking if he was scared, which irritates him even more. The fight begins with Victor charging at him with his speed. The moment he intends to land a punch on Seth's face, someone yells out for him. His coach appears, panting at the door, and disrupts the two's fight. He asks who the people outside the gym are, which makes the two curious. When Seth goes out, he sees his driver subduing the vandals who wanted to invade the gym. He asks what happened, and the driver explains that they intended to attack. Our protagonist asks who they were and why they did it. The driver says he has no idea why, and Seth decides to take one of them to ask better. Back at the Sunshine Building, they hear that the gym has unpaid debts, and that's why they were going to settle accounts. He asks if the idea was to forcibly take over the gym building with that, but the man says they intended to buy the coach's gym. Seth asks his uncle what they should do, and he asks what the protagonist would like to be done. Back at school, the teacher says Victor hasn't arrived and asks if anyone would have any idea where he was. Everyone starts to suspect that Seth did something to him the day before, and Sophie turns around. Then the teacher just ignores the absence and decides to start the class anyway. Hours pass, and Victor still doesn't show up in the classroom. Suddenly, he appears in the room and goes to the table to talk to Seth outside. The two leave the room and leave Sophie even more worried. On the side of a school building, Victor stands in front of Seth holding an envelope. He shows it and asks what exactly that envelope was, explaining that he received it the day before. Victor comments that his and his father's debt were paid with interest, and Seth questions what he means. This irritates him, and he asks if this was Seth's doing. But Seth asks what the problem would be with that. With that answer, Victor tells Seth not to meddle in his family's problems, but the protagonist asks if that's how he protects his pride. His phrase irritates Victor even more, who grabs his collar, but Seth tells him to return the money if he doesn't want the help. But Victor explains that the collectors disappeared and asks what he had done with those collectors. Seth frees himself, telling Victor to just focus on his boxing. He also reminds Victor of the promise he made to his father to become a world champion. Then Victor steps back when he realizes that Seth knew about it, and Seth warns that he can call him out for a fight whenever he wants. As Seth walks away, Victor can only watch him leave, which again disturbs him. Back in the classroom, Sophie stares at the door waiting for her beloved to return. But when he arrives, she gets startled, asking what she was doing. She tries to make up an excuse, saying she thought he had gone to fight again. Seth teases her, asking if she was worried about him. Then she blushes and comes up with a class representative speech, saying she feels responsible for them. With that, Seth says he won't fight with the boys from their class, noticing that she hasn't changed at all. Sophie doesn't understand, and he explains that she has always been kind and concerned about everyone. As he leaves, Sophie just watches him go while someone watches them from afar. The council president gets annoyed with Seth's closeness and says he should know his place. In an old Japanese-style house, Derek waits seated in an empty room. A man in a half-open kimono full of tattoos asks for permission to open the door. Inside that other room was the leader of the Santu Onikai gang, Meduki Ryushin. Derek bows his head, apologizing to the leader, who only mentions that he was extremely disappointed with his subordinate. He apologizes again, trying to ask for another chance to fulfill his mission, explaining that since the heir has not yet been confirmed, they could take over Sunshine if they received help from the gang. At that moment, Ryushin breaks his pipe, hitting the ground with all his force. Ryushin praises having heard that the heir was very young. He remembers that even being very young, he was still the heir and he should be more cautious. Then he explains that they should look for what the heir's weakness is, because as he is not an adult, he must have a weakness. Derek begins to remember moments he saw Seth with his mother after his father's death and believes he knows what his weakness would be. But the gang leader already advances that he must work calmly and make sure not to fail this time. A group of boys appears in the protagonist's room led by Gabe, who is still recovering. He already yells at everyone. asking who the new kid was, and Seth introduces himself. Gabe looks at him angrily, asking if it was him who defeated Brock, and calls Seth out of the room. But this time Seth stays in place and asks if they think he's a dog to go when called. This irritates Gabe until Victor arrives, telling him to get out of his way. When the other boys notice who it was, they become worried. Gabe gets angry at that, and Sam appears in the room, telling him not to touch the new kid. Sam mentions that he would join the judo club, leaving everyone confused. The two argue in the room while Seth continues to be confused by this whole story. But then another person approaches the room thinking they had guests. At that moment, he observes the corridor, noticing a group of people approaching. The head of the Moon Club, Damien Cha, complains to the boy who was approaching for going there too. That boy was the head of the Kendo Club, Scott Choi, who also brought a group of students. With that, Seth sighs, asking what was happening while fixing his hair. Seeing the mess this was becoming, Sophie calls everyone's attention. She says that because of them, the whole class was uncomfortable. Each of them gives their excuses for why they were there, and Sophie simply expels everyone from the room. After closing the door, she turns to Seth, saying he can be more at ease now. Except she forgot the main door where they try to re-enter. Ignoring Sophie, everyone comes back to surround him to call him to the sports clubs. While Seth thinks about what he should do with these people, Sophie just tries to expel them from the room. At that moment, the physical education teacher appears, complaining to everyone. After everyone stares at each other, the teacher says he understands what happened and sends everyone to their rooms. Seeing that they wouldn't have much to do, everyone leaves the room with Gabe warning that he would come back to talk to him later. The teacher calls Seth to the counseling room, but he doesn't understand what happened. In the counseling room, the teacher remembers that they were an athlete's school and tries to ask him to join a club. Seth is confused by the request until the teacher remembers about Brock. He explains that Brock was like him in the first year, with all the clubs wanting to call him to their teams until he got involved in the fight. Our protagonist understands that the teacher wants to prevent him from causing problems, replying that he's fine. But he already advances that he doesn't have time to dedicate himself to sports. The teacher gets irritated, asking how busy he could be being a first-year boy. He believes that Seth was just joking around, and the protagonist says he's more than he seems. He also advances that those who should be there were the students, not him. With that, the teacher is left without an answer, and Seth asks him to tell the students not to bother him anymore. Seth completes, saying that he doesn't run away from a fight. Meanwhile, Jason listens from behind the door, returning to complain about him for finding him arrogant. Jason heads to an abandoned building of the school where a group of boys gather to smoke. A boy is impressed by the presence of the council president there. He asks what the president wanted, and he replies that he would like their help to get rid of someone. At the end of the day, Seth is leaving school and heading to his car. As he passes through a gap in the wall, a guy emerges from behind him with a piece of wood and hits him. Some time passes, and Seth begins to regain consciousness in front of the guy Jason was talking to. The boy smiles and starts talking to him while Seth stares at him with his injured head. When he manages to stand up, the boy with a piece of wood hits him in the back. Then Seth stares at him seriously and gets annoyed with the protagonist's look. One of the boys from the classroom says he seemed very weak for someone who defeated Brock, and another boy tells him not to be rude. As he stands up, Seth says he's in an interesting situation. The group leader is impressed that he isn't scared of the current situation. At that moment, the boy with a piece of wood tries to hit him again. But this time, the protagonist is prepared and ducks, aiming a punch at his hand. This blow returns the attack and disarms him, sending the wood flying into the air. With that, the group leader is impressed with the move while the boy screams in pain from the blow. His hand was completely destroyed, and Seth just says he was being too noisy. Then he lands 2 punches on him, knocking him down before asking who those people were. While the leader is speechless, Seth says he doesn't care much about who they were and just wants to resolve this quickly. The leader says he's arrogant and orders everyone to go after him, making the group surround the protagonist. Seth observes his adversaries well, and when the leader orders them to attack, they all charge at him. Our protagonist lets out a slight sigh, preparing to fight, and when he's ready, he starts knocking down his adversaries. One by one, they are knocked down by Seth's blows, while one of them tries to catch him off guard with a chain. Seth manages to free himself, hitting his face while another henchman tries to grab him from behind. But the protagonist pulls the chain boy, throwing him against his other sneaky adversary, knocking them both down. At that moment, he grabs the chain, saying it was fun while showing a sadistic smile. The leader gets angry again, ordering his henchmen to finish Seth off quickly. Then they go to get the bats to end the fight once and for all. As soon as they start trying to hit him, Seth dodges the first attack. With that, he strings together blows on each of the aligned henchmen, getting rid of all those in his way, until he is caught by surprise, becoming immobilized while another boy approaches with the bat. As he prepares to hit the protagonist, he quickly lands a kick to the face while throwing the other against a wall. After freeing himself, the protagonist turns against the boy who immobilized him, landing a series of punches. Another boy tries to catch him off guard with a bat in hand to finish the fight. He manages to hit the protagonist's head, who stands up feeling the pain of the blow. When he sees his own blood, he simply loses his head as he turns to his adversaries. At that moment, he charges at the remaining boys from the group. Their leader is simply without reaction to what he just saw. His entire group was completely defeated by Seth, who remained standing. With that, he notices that the protagonist was the same boy who finished off his friends with a brick when they were younger. When he charges at the leader, he cowers in fear of the protagonist. Seth grabs him by the neck, asking him to tell who was the guy who sent them to do this. After settling things in the abandoned building, he returns to the school building. Meanwhile, in the council room, the president waits with 2 other members. Jason wonders why he hasn't received news from the group while Seth approaches the council room, until the protagonist opens the door of the room, leaving the president surprised. Seth approaches him slowly while Jason stands up, facing the protagonist. He asks what Seth was doing in that room, and the protagonist just smiles at him. At that moment, he grabs the president's neck and hits him against the table. Our protagonist asks why he was attacked on his order. But then Sophie arrives in the room to talk to Jason and finds Seth interrogating him. Seth lifts the president back up, saying he was a lucky guy. After releasing him, he heads for the door while Sophie watches him frightened. He understands what the situation was and simply heads for the door, leaving Sophie behind. The next day, she sits disheartened at her desk, still remembering what she saw the night before, and tries to turn to Seth. At that time, Seth's car arrives at the school with his uncle saying he wouldn't question what happened. But he says he would provide some bodyguards for him. Even with Seth insisting nothing happened, his uncle doesn't believe it because his face was cut from the blow he received. The two argue a bit about the situation until Seth puts an end to it, telling him not to do that. But his uncle reminds that they are having problems with the leaders of Buzan and Pohan. He already advances that it's better for Seth to be prepared while he asks only that they stay out of sight. When he arrives at the classroom, Sophie is startled to see him. Arriving at his desk, Victor teases him, saying it was a shame while asking if they had beaten him up. Although Seth explains that it was 11 against 1, Victor just says it was nonsense. An announcement comes over the loudspeakers calling Seth to the principal's office, which makes Sophie and Victor curious. Victor asks if something happened with Jason, because his uncle is the principal and his father is the real owner of the school. Already advancing also for him to be careful because it's not well known what he is capable of. When he opens the door of the room, he sees Jason with several school employees. The principal, Calvin Shin, confirms the protagonist's name and mentions that he has caused many problems since his transfer. At that moment, Jason lets a slight smile escape, knowing the outcome of this conversation. He begins to list Seth's cases of fights, including the assault on the council president. With that, he concludes by mentioning that Seth was expelled from school. The president keeps smiling until he notices that Seth just looks at that comment with a smile, asking if that was serious. Right after that, he pulls out his cell phone to make a call. In a few seconds of conversation with his uncle, he orders to buy the school he attends. Several cars start to appear in front of the school, which makes the students curious. Seth's uncle steps out of one of the cars, heading to the school followed by their bodyguards. Calvin notices the commotion of his uncle arriving and asks what Seth had done. At that moment, the group opens the door to the principal's office. Jason tries to question who those men were but ends up being immobilized by the driver, who tells him to stay quiet. Approaching the principal, the uncle hands him an envelope. The principal gets angry with them for invading the school, and the uncle just tells him to read the content inside the envelope. After staring for a while, he opens the envelope and is shocked to see the content. It's mentioned that the principal had been involving the foundation in illegal activities for years, and the uncle promises not to mention anything if they hand over the school. Calvin gets angry, but as he tries to complain, he is grabbed by the neck. Then the uncle mentions that he had been spending the students' lunch money for his own benefit and that they should resolve this calmly. Back at the Shin house, Calvin talks to his brother, apologizing, because he had been forced to sell the school, which angers him. His brother complains to him, asking if he had gone crazy, and all he receives in response are more excuses. He examines the documents, noticing that it was the Sunshine Group, saying they are a bunch of criminals. When Jason arrives in the room, his father asks what happened at school. Jason explains everything that happened in recent days, and his father just picks up the phone to call the senator. He asks the secretary if they had heard of the Sunshine Group. Meanwhile, at the Sunshine Building, the uncle explains what was done, saying it was easy because they were guilty. Although Seth asks if this could cause problems, the uncle starts listing all the crimes they found in their records. Our protagonist is impressed with how much he discovered in one day, and the uncle remembers that since he went to that school, they were prepared. But then the uncle asks who will be the new director of the Youngjin Foundation because he believes Seth would choose the new director. However, although he believes Seth had someone in mind, he simply hadn't thought about it yet. The next day, Seth arrives at school, heading straight to his desk. As he sits down, Victor watches him curiously, who ends up noticing the look and starts watching him back. After staring at each other for a while, Victor gives up and turns his head down again. Sophie watches Seth from afar and gathers the courage to approach him again. She asks if something happened because she didn't see him after he went to the principal's office. Seth asks if she was worried about him even after seeing him that way, and she says he's a classmate. Our protagonist gives a light laugh and smiles at her, saying she didn't need to worry. But at that moment, Jason arrives in the room, bursting through the door, calling for Seth. Everyone is impressed with the president's visit while waiting for him to say something. Jason asks if Seth believed he would be afraid of a pathetic criminal like him. But as soon as Seth stands up to go to him, Jason simply slams the door shut, running away, which leaves him without reaction. Back in the principal's office, the physical education teacher knocks on the door and a man gives permission to enter. Seth's uncle asks him to sit down while he continues to look out the window. He asks if the uncle was looking for him and tries to find out how he could help. Then he requests that the teacher become the new principal of the school, as it was the order of the new owner of the school. At the end of that day, Seth prepares to leave and Jason waits for him in an alley with his friends. He explains that they were supposed to bring the protagonist to him. One of the boys is impressed that it was just about capturing a high schooler while remembering that he needed the money anyway. But when he sees who it was, he is shocked while Seth gets into the car. Jason is confused and the boy gets angry, saying that he wanted them to catch a murderer, throwing the money in his face. All the boys run away, leaving Jason behind, which angers him even more, wanting to know more about Seth. Looking at the street, he sees a line of black cars taking Seth away, which impresses him even more. Back at Seth's mother's restaurant, she mentions that he was having fun. He explains that so far it has all been very entertaining. But when Seth asks why they don't live with his father, it makes her tense. Seeing her reaction, Seth says she doesn't need to answer if it's too difficult. His mother forces a smile, saying she will tell him another time. With that response, Seth just excuses himself from his mother, leaving the restaurant while she watches him worriedly. Then she remembers the moment Seth's father asked to separate for a while when Seth was a baby. She revolts, asking to stay together while his father says he wouldn't want to put the two of them in danger. Seth's mother looks at her son and understands her husband's concern. Back in the present, Derek arrives at her restaurant, saying it's been a while since they saw each other, which worries her. On the way to school, the uncle explains that the physical education teacher would be the new principal. While analyzing the school's data, seeing that it was in poor condition, Seth asks if they can use the company's money. The uncle's plan was to invest $3 million or more with the intention of making it an athletic school again. Seth wonders if it's possible, and the uncle explains that the students can help with that. He emphasizes that in Korea, money is power, and Seth remembers that they have money. Back at school, the two classmates are sleeping during the old teacher's class, until suddenly, Seth's cell phone receives a call from the head of the bosom group. When he answers the call, he hears Derek trying to provoke him, but gets annoyed that Seth doesn't recognize him. When he tries to explain the reason for calling, Seth warns that he was in class time and hangs up the call. Seeing that he would insist on calling back, Seth turns off his cell phone. Meanwhile, in a building under construction, Derek hears the notice that the phone was not available. This irritates him greatly while Seth's mother just sits in front of him. Derek orders his henchmen to go after him, thinking that this time he will finish Seth off. At that moment, the protagonist was dreaming about Victor's spiky hair, imagining he would get hurt trying to touch it. At the end of the day, Seth leaves school, finding a silver van stopping in front of the school. Derek's henchmen get out of the van, stopping in front of Seth. Our protagonist asks who those two were, and the henchmen ask him to follow them. At that moment, the driver arrives and asks what they thought they were doing. When the henchmen turn around, they recognize the driver Rod, who gets angry with them for trying to boss his boss around. Seth talks to them again, asking what they wanted, and then one of the henchmen pulls out his cell phone from his suit. They explain that it was a request from Derek, and Seth takes the cell phone from their hands. As soon as Seth looks at the cell phone, he is startled to see his mother sitting in a chair in a kind of captivity. The henchman asks him to follow them again until he notices Seth's furious expression. Using the hand with the cell phone, Seth lands a punch on one of the henchmen. When the second one thinks of retaliating, he throws the cell phone to distract him and land a blow. Taking advantage of the punch, he pushes the henchman to the ground, still in fury, embedding 2 teeth in his fist. He holds the henchman's head and orders him to tell where they were keeping his mother. Upon finding out, all the bodyguards' cars follow to the location while Seth calls his uncle, who tries to keep him calm. Our protagonist yells, remembering that they kidnapped his mother, but his uncle tells him not to stoop to their level. Back in captivity, Derek is again trying to make a call with no success and doesn't understand why. He looks at Seth's mother, saying he has nothing against her, but he doesn't think it's right for a child to be running sunshine. However, his mother says that Seth will do a better job than him, leaving Derek irritated. She says he's just a delinquent as she stands up from her chair to tower over him. The protagonist's mother ends up losing her smile and stares at him with a serious and aggressive look. Then the uncle reveals something to Seth that leaves him completely surprised. The protagonist is inside the car, very irritated by what they did to his mother. His fleet of cars arrives at the designated location. Seth starts to get out of the car and his uncle is waiting. Adjusting his tie, he asks where his mother is. The man turns his face, indicating that she is inside. Without thinking twice, the boy starts running. Then he goes up the stairs. Arriving forcefully, he kicks the door. His mother is serene as if nothing had happened. Surprised, Kang calls for his mother. Looking around, he realizes that all the men are lying on the floor while the woman is standing. Derek is being held by his shirt. In the background, the boy asks what is going on. Seeing that it is his mother standing, he is in shock. Suddenly, his uncle arrives, apologizing to the woman, saying that he will leave the rest to her. Terrified, the man starts screaming. begging the boy to save him. Hurt and trembling with fear, he keeps repeating for them to save him. Then the woman walks away. Bowing his head, the uncle shows his respect for her. Leaving the place, she tells her son to go as they need to open the cafe. Frightened, he looks at his mother while she remains serious. Sometime later at the cafe, Seth asks about what happened. Dodging the question, his mother asks what he means by that. Curious, he asks how she managed. Smiling, she replies that it is a secret, which leaves the protagonist even more confused. However, she makes it clear that she will tell him everything when the right time comes. But the boy says he doesn't understand. Happily, she says that he doesn't need to understand because she is still his mother no matter what happens. After her response, he just stares in silence. Outside, the driver is smoking calmly. Getting out of the car, the uncle arrives. Quickly, the driver bows. The uncle is watching the two. Suddenly, he starts getting very angry. Remembering the past when Seth was still a baby, his mother was playing with him using a yo-yo. However, she hit the boy's head hard. He falls to the ground, startled. He starts crying in despair and keeps crying a lot and screaming. His mother tries to calm the baby. Playing with the yo-yo again, she almost hit him, but the boy manages to dodge. But as he has no control over his body, he falls to the ground again. Picking him up, she begins to hug her son. His father shakes his head watching the scene. In the background, the uncle observes everything in silence, as if he had a secret. Back to the present, he is with the driver outside the cafe. Breaking the silence, he calls Rami, the driver. He reveals that the Yakuza were behind all the rebellion that happened in Busan. After the answer, the man remains silent. Irritated, he curses the Yakuza group deeply. The uncle tells Rami to take better care of the boss, and the man bows, saying that he will, and says that he can keep the gun in his hands. Laughing, the man is happy with this news, thanking the uncle for that. Changing the subject, he asks the driver if there is someone they can send to the school. He explains that the leader of Santu Onikai, named Midaki Ryushin, is going after the boss and that they need more bodyguards. This catches the man's attention. Then he continues saying that he needs to find someone capable of pretending to be a new student. Sometime later at Sophie's house, she is a little upset while eating. Her father watches his upset daughter. Curious, he asks if something happened to her. The girl responds that it's nothing. Concerned, her father says that if someone is bothering her, she just needs to say, and he will handle it. Laughing, she says that he is a prosecutor and shouldn't say such things, and her father replies that the most important thing is that his daughter is okay. But the girl says it's not a problem, so he doesn't need to worry. This catches the man's attention. Staring seriously, he says that it seems like something happened. Sophie says nothing happened and asks to finish eating. Annoyed, the man remains silent, while his daughter fills herself with yogurt. Sometime later, on the girl's apartment balcony, her father is on the phone. Talking to Jason, he says he is Sophie's father. On the other side of the line, the president of the council says he was about to call the man. Then he explains that there have been some issues with the new student, and he was wondering if he should inform the father or not. Quickly, the man becomes irritated, gripping the balcony. With much anger, he asks him to tell everything that happened. Meanwhile, in front of the cafe, Kang's mother asks where her son is. The man responds that he is at home. On the ground, she asks if he wants anything, and the uncle says no, he just wanted to say he's sorry. Standing up, the woman tells him not to worry, and the uncle says they will take her home, as it's still not safe. Smiling, she asks if he has already forgotten. Then she comments that she will stay away from her son out of love, and that the man just needs to focus on Seth. After that comment, he remains silent. At his home, the boy is sleeping, tossing and turning constantly, but then he gets up as he can't sleep anymore. The boy is very scared, wondering where his mother is. Jumping to Rod, the driver's story, let's see who the man is. He is someone who has a hobby of racing. Sometime later, at a dojo, this man is smoking his pipe, asking his subordinate if they failed, and the guy says yes. Annoyed, the old man says he can't trust the Koreans. Standing up, his subordinate asks what will happen to Sunshine. Answering with another question, he asks if their leader is in the preparatory, and the man says yes. With a serious look, he orders them to send Acura there. Just mentioning the name, the man is already afraid. However, the old man says they will take him down, and for that, they need to use everything they've got. Meanwhile, at Yeongjum School, several students are in the courtyard. From the window, the new principal just watches. He's the former physical education teacher who became a principal. Adjusting his chair in front of all that paperwork, he sits while sighing with distress, saying that he was just a teacher, and that he will see how all this will work out. Suddenly, the phone starts ringing. Quickly, the principal answers. On the other end of the line, the caller says they are from the Sushine Corporation. Getting the news, the uncle says there will be a new student, ordering him to place the student in the same class as Seth Kang, and the principal questions the reason for that. Hanging up, the man doesn't answer the question. Someone starts knocking on the door, making the principal tremble. Then the person opens the door. Seeing who it is, the former teacher is frightened. It's Brock, who already seems better. Surprised, he asks what the boy is doing in this room since he never comes to school. Looking serious, he replies that he came to congratulate the man on being the new principal and also to ask for a favor. Not understanding anything, he asks what favor he wants. Lowering his head, he asks to let him join the school because he wants to graduate. This leaves the principal very confused, not understanding anything that is happening. In the school hallway, a student is walking. Inside the classroom, the students are listening to the teacher, who quickly says they have new students, leaving everyone confused. Looking to the side, she says he can come in. Then the man opens the door. Everyone in the room is silent. When the new student turns around, all the others are surprised and scared. The teacher asks him to introduce himself. In a casual manner, he says his name is Brock Chang, leaving all the students in shock. Annoyed by the noise, the teacher tells them to be quiet and asks the other new student to come in. The other new student begins to enter, standing side by side with Brock. Introducing himself, he says he is Jun Kim, saying it's a pleasure to meet everyone, and the girls fall in love with the new student's appearance. Jealous, the boys in the room are bothered by this. Nervous, the teacher adjusts her glasses while asking if these students are really in high school. Turning to the front of the class, she tells the students to take the empty seats at the back of the room. Brock goes first, and as he walks, many students are frightened. The two new students walk towards the back of the room, leaving everyone uncomfortable. Arriving in front of the protagonist, the man just stares. But Seth doesn't feel intimidated at all, letting out a very sadistic smile. Sometime later at school, suddenly, the classic car arrives. The driver tells Miss Akira that they have arrived. She seems to be speaking another language and asks if he's going to this school. Fixing her hair, she says she can't wait to see the protagonist soon. Meanwhile, inside the school, Victor and Seth are sleeping as usual. The two new students are beside them, leaving everyone in the room very scared. The teacher asks if everyone in the class is going on the graduate trip. However, everyone remains completely silent. Breaking the ice, the woman looks to the back of the room, asking if they are also going. Smiling kindly, Jun Kim confirms that he is going. With a blank expression, Brock remains silent. Then he looks to the side. Seeing the two sleeping, he says he'll go too. A little nervous, the teacher says she'll see them tomorrow. As she leaves, she asks everyone to befriend the new students. When she leaves, everyone becomes desperate. Suddenly, the two bullies wake up and stand. At that moment, Brock also stands, scaring the students in front of him. Looking at the big guy, Kim just watches. Then the bully approaches Victor and the protagonist. Seth remains silent, staring at him. But Brock does the same. Intervening, Victor says he'll let the two handle things, adjusting his backpack to leave. However, the big guy stops him with his arm. The size difference between them is huge. Irritated, Victor asks what he's doing. From his corner, the new student just watches the commotion. He smiles as it seems he's enjoying it. Sometime later in the school courtyard, with his hand in his pocket and irritated, Victor asks if he wants to fight. Replying, Brock supposes the teenager isn't stupid enough to do that. Reacting to this, Victor becomes very angry. Furious, he calls him a bastard and asks if now that Seth beat him up, he's an easy target. However, the big guy just stays quiet. Victor drops his bag on the ground, remembering how his previous fight with this guy went. He had a big advantage, and if it weren't for the teacher, he would have finished off the bully. Without thinking twice, he prepares for combat and calls Brock to attack. Cutting the tension, the big guy says it will be in the ring, concluding that gloves will be used. Confused, the blonde asks what he means by that. Explaining, Brock says he wants to learn boxing, and that he can learn properly if he fights against the blonde. This leaves Victor even more confused. At the same time, in front of the school, the protagonist walks. His classmate starts following him. Stammering, she calls out to her classmate. She's very nervous, unable to speak, and Seth asks if he did something wrong. Replying, Sophie says no, she just wanted to ask if he's free on Saturday, which confuses him for a moment. Handing him 2 tickets, she says she got 2 movie passes. Showing the tickets, she says she heard it's going to be a good movie. Excited, the hero accepts immediately, surprising the girl who asks if he's serious, and the boy confirms that he is. Reacting to this, she sighs in relief. While holding the tickets, she smiles, saying that's good. Watching her, the protagonist gets an idea. Suddenly, he asks if she's free today, asking if the girl wants to grab something to eat. Sophie remains silent because the invitation was unexpected, and the protagonist says he found a very good place. Then, she starts to smile. Excited, she says she wants to go and that she's hungry. Seth asks if she likes spicy food, and laughing, the girl asks who doesn't, asking if that place is really good, and the two continue talking as the sun sets. The hero's car arrives in front of the school. Someone walks over to the car while the driver waits. Then they knock on the door to get his attention. Seeing who it is, the driver starts to roll down the window and asks what will happen if the boss finds out. But the mysterious man says not to worry. It's the new student Jun Kim who says their boss is going on a date. Totally confused, Rodney doesn't understand what he means. Changing the subject, the student asks if he has a cigarette. Annoyed, he asks for a cigarette, saying pretending to be a student is suffocating. Irritated, the driver asks if he's crazy for wanting to smoke in a uniform. Looking down, he says the man is right. Laughing, Rodney starts to light his cigarette, and Kim says he's really bad. While smoking, he asks how the school is going. Calmly, Kim says they're just kids. However, the driver says nothing can happen to the boss, and the new student tells him not to worry about that. Showing a hidden blade in his sleeve, he says the driver already knows him. Later that night, in the boxing gym, Victor is fighting Brock. He punches while Brock defends, but quickly, the speed begins to increase. Brock continues to defend, but now with difficulty. While hitting, the blonde notices an opening and prepares to strike, landing a direct blow to the big guy's ribs, who feels a lot of pain, looking to the side. Without realizing, another blow approaches, this time near the face. With no time to react, he takes a left hook straight to the middle of his face. Victor is very focused on the fight. Brock starts having difficulty staying on his feet, which catches his opponent's attention. Confident, he asks if he really wants to continue the fight. The man remains silent. Opening his eyes, he asks if that's all he's got. Reacting to that question, the blonde becomes deeply irritated, to the point where his veins become visible. Throwing another punch, he says that Brock can't even punch properly. He continues throwing more and more punches as Brock stays on the defensive. Victor is already sweating from how much he's punching. Opening his eyes, Brock still stays defensive. Preparing for another hit, Victor says that the bully wanted to learn boxing and tells him to try hitting him. Aiming for his head, Victor tries to finish with a final blow. However, something catches his attention. For the first time, the man managed to dodge the punch. The two stare at each other, frozen. Trembling, Brock prepares to counterattack. He rushes forward with everything he's got. The punch approaches and Victor defends himself. After that, he steps back, walking until he hits the corner of the ring. Cornered, he prepares himself as the big guy gets ready to attack. Brock tries to land another blow, but Victor dodges by ducking. Quickly, he lands a perfect uppercut. After the punch, he returns to his stance, and the man just keeps watching. Annoyed, the blonde wonders if the guy will ever manage to hit him even once. Interrupting his thoughts, Brock asks what he's doing and tells him to attack. Hearing this, Victor becomes deeply irritated and calls him a bastard. The two rush at each other with full force. Meanwhile, in the movie theater, the potential couple is watching what seems to be an action horror movie. Sophie is trembling with fear. She grabs onto the protagonist's jacket. Cleverly, he places his hand over hers. Noticing the physical contact, the girl looks down. In response, she pulls back shyly while the boy just laughs. Sometime later, the movie ends. Everyone starts leaving the theater. Seth and Sophie are leaving the room as well. He asks if the girl liked the movie, and she says yes. In turn, the protagonist says he liked it too. Smiling, she says she's glad to hear that, and that she's heading home, but interrupting her, the new student asks if she doesn't want to grab something to eat. After the question, she seems confused, and the boy asks if it's not normal to eat after a movie, and if that's not how dates work. Stammering, Sophie asks if this is a date. Suddenly, he grabs her hand. Happily, he says he knows the perfect place. Inside the Sunshine building, they're in a restaurant. The girl starts looking around. Leaning in, she whispers, asking if the place is expensive, and smiling, the boy tells her not to worry and to eat. A waiter comes to the table, placing all the silverware and plates. She then thanks him for it. As the man walks away, the girl sighs, which leaves the boy confused. Continuing, she says she still thinks it's too much, and the boy tells her not to worry because it's free. Sophie asks what he means by that, and the boy explains that the restaurant belongs to the company, so they can eat without paying. Still not fully understanding, she asks what he's talking about, and the protagonist replies that it's complicated, but that he's richer than she thinks. After hearing this, she smiles. Intrigued, the new student asks if she thinks it's a lie. However, Sophie explains that's not it, and the boy asks why she's laughing. Embarrassed, she responds that she laughed because she got jealous when he said he's rich. Changing the subject, Seth asks when their second date will be, making the girl blush entirely. Another day on the road. A fleet of cars is heading somewhere else. Inside the car are the protagonist, his uncle, and the driver. Breaking the silence, the uncle says he'll send people to Jeju Island, explaining that the Japanese gangs must be planning something. In disbelief, the boy says it's a school trip and that nothing will happen. After hearing the response, the man remains silent. The boy also stays quiet. Sometime later, the car stops. Stepping out, he sighs, saying he's leaving. But he stops and tells him not to worry because nothing will happen. Then he slams the door shut. He's walking near some houses. With his arms crossed, the man calls for the driver, ordering him to go with the boy. Confused, Rodney says Jab is already there. However, the uncle explains that he's already told the Jeju gangs to watch him, but that he'd feel less worried if the driver was there too. Following the order, Rodney says he'll do it. He gets excited, thinking about the idea of going to Jeju. Then they take the plane and go. Sometime later on Jeju Island, all the students are excited after arriving. The teacher appears behind one of them. Punching him on the head, she tells them to quiet down. She asks if they're all babies. Angrily, she orders everyone to get on the bus. After they board, the teacher asks if everyone is there and the driver confirms. Soon, the bus sets off. Some time passes, and they arrive at the Jeju Tourist Hotel. They begin to get off the bus. Among those on the trip are Sophie, Brock, Victor, Kim, and Seth. After gathering everyone, the teacher asks if all the students have disembarked. Flipping through a sheet of paper, she mentions that the class is on the 8th floor and that their names are on the doors of their rooms, giving them 1 hour to unpack. After her explanation, the buses start to leave. Inside the hotel, the students begin searching for their rooms. The new student finds his room door. In the same room will be Seth, Victor, and Brock, And with that, the protagonist says that they make a great team. Walking down the hallway, Kim mentions that he'll be staying in the room next to the boys. Entering the room, the hero says it looks nice. Suddenly, he claims one of the beds. In the background, Victor calls out to Brock, questioning why he took the big bed. But Brock asks if he has a problem with that. The two stare at each other. An hour later at Jali, all the students are gathered, talking among themselves. Inside the bus, the teacher tells the students to pay attention to the correct bus as there are other schools and instructs them to return by 3 p.m. At that, several students begin to board. Steph is sleeping without a care in the world. However, someone calls for him, waking him up. It's Sophie, inviting him for a walk. Grinning from ear to ear, he accepts. Meanwhile, Victor is lying on the grass, resting. But something catches his attention. It's a group of students walking by. They seem to be heading somewhere. Seeing this, Victor gets irritated, calling someone in damn Chinese and saying they look pretty strong. Brock passes by them calmly. Elsewhere, Kim is smoking, but someone taps his shoulder, catching his attention. It's the driver, Rodney. They start talking and laughing. At the same time, Seth is leaving with Sophie, walking down a staircase while chatting, but someone steps in their way. The protagonist just stares at him. It's the Chinese students that Victor had seen earlier. One of them comments that Korean girls are beautiful and invites her to hang out. Hearing this, Sophie becomes very uncomfortable. Then the guy asks why she isn't spending time with them instead of being with this weak boy. Hearing that, Seth stays silent. Irritated, he asks what they're talking about. In response, the students remain silent. Without saying a word, the boy watches them with an expression of anger. Suddenly, Sophie steps in, surprising everyone. Speaking in Chinese, she asks what they want. This shocks the boy. Even the Chinese students are surprised to hear this. Continuing, she tells them not to give Koreans a bad impression of Chinese people because of their behavior. Smiling, one of them asks if she knows their language, and the other asks if the skinny boy is her boyfriend. Ignoring them, Sophie just turns around. Placing her hand on the hero's arm, she asks him to leave. Calmly, he obeys. Then the two begin to climb the stairs. In the background, the three mock them, leaving the protagonist deeply irritated. They head to a park. Surprised by the news, the boy asks if she speaks Chinese. Responding, she says that when she was little, she lived in China for a few years because of her father, and that she continues to study it to avoid forgetting. Impressed, he says that's amazing. However, he asks what they said. She replies, telling him not to worry because those guys didn't say anything important. Standing up, the hero announces that he's going to the bathroom. With a frightening look, he says he'll be right back. Then he starts walking toward the supposed bathroom. However, he arrives at that staircase from before. From the top, he calls out to the group, staring at them with a crazed look. Quickly, he jumps towards them with everything he's got. Sophie is sitting on the bench waiting. The boy returns, explaining that the bathroom was a bit far and she says it's okay, asking what they're going to do now. Pointing to another spot, he says the view is amazing nearby and invites her to go take a picture. Soon, they head there while laughing. A man arrives at the scene surprised. Seeing his colleagues lying on the ground, he asks what happened. Approaching one of them, he punches him in the head to wake him up, asking what really happened. Nervously, the guy says a Korean boy defeated the group. Irritated, their leader asks if he's not ashamed to lose to a Korean. He continues, saying they will catch this Korean now. Looking back, he orders his henchmen to split up and find him. Nearby, two students are walking together. Suddenly, something grabs their attention. Two Chinese students arrive, kicking and asking if they were the ones who attacked their friends. As one of them prepares to strike again, his colleague says it's obviously not them and tells him to keep looking. Wandering around, they find Victor sleeping. Confident in his find, the man says there's a Korean boy right here. The group begins to approach and surround the boy. Quickly, one of them kicks him. Waking up, Victor asks what they're looking for, but the man says it's probably not him. Standing up, irritated, he asks again what they're looking for. He questions who they think they're staring at. Smiling, he asks if they want to fight. Excited, the blonde begins to get up. However, the Chinese student tells him to sit back down. He keeps repeating it, but a fist approaches. He's cut off mid-sentence by a punch right to the face. Because of the punch, he crashes to the ground hard. His classmates surround him, and Victor asks what that guy just said. Elsewhere, Brock is sitting on the grass, looking at the scenery. Someone calls him, making him look back. It's a Chinese student asking if he was the one who beat his boys. Concluding that he looks pretty strong. Staring, Brock remains silent. Suddenly, the guy charges at him, throwing a punch, but the big guy blocks it. Still with his back turned, he blocks the punch by grabbing the opponent's hand. Trembling, the guy says nothing. Breaking the silence, Brock thanks him, saying he was starting to get bored. Gritting his teeth, the man calls him a kid. Preparing for another hit, he tells Brock to release his hand. But the big guy isn't fazed at all. He blocks the man's punch again. Quickly, Brock spins around, grabbing the man from behind. Irritated, the guy calls him a damn bastard. However, Brock starts squeezing him in a bear hug. He starts lifting him up with all his strength, and finally finishes him with a deadly Greek wrestling move. The Chinese students are stunned, watching the fight. Brock tells them to come at him, calling them damn bastards. A while later, several students begin heading to their respective buses. Outside, the teacher is noting down who is boarding. Several students are already on the bus, and the student who got beaten for no reason is still irritated. Seated in their spots, the future couple is laughing. Someone enters the bus, catching Seth's attention. The one who enters is actually Victor. This makes the protagonist curious. As he walks by, the blonde passes near their seat, then sits down behind the two. Brock also enters the bus. He starts walking, and the hero becomes confused as well. The two latecomers have arrived. Seeing them both, the protagonist stays quiet. Then it shows how Victor defeated his opponents. And the same happened when Brock faced them. Some time passes, and the couple continues chatting. Entering the bus, the teacher asks Sophie if everyone has arrived. Standing up and looking around, she checks. However, she says the new student, Kim, isn't there, and irritated, the teacher comments that she had warned everyone to return on time. Meanwhile, in that same place, Kim is smoking with the driver, and the two are talking. Suddenly, a woman approaches, making the driver nervous. Turning his face, Kim gets ready. Quickly, he starts pulling a weapon from his sleeve. However, the one who arrives is the teacher, the killer Aura. With a vacant stare, she asks what the new student is doing in this place. Nervous, the man thinks he's screwed now. Later that night, at the hotel, Brock is looking at himself in the window. Sif is lying on the bed listening to music. Victor is training, doing push-ups. Then Brock looks at the protagonist. Noticing someone is watching him, Seth removes his headphones and asks what it is. The man replies that he'll see soon enough. This leaves the boy confused, but he quickly smiles and puts his headphones back on. Elsewhere in the hotel, the driver Kim and the teacher are together. Deeply irritated, she asks about a student smoking, asking if he knows how harmful it is to smoke in his age. Then she says she thought he was a bit better than the other new student and asks where he learned such behavior. However, he shows her a card. It's the ID of a man born in 1991. Seeing this, she's shocked that he's 27 years old and says he's 3 years older than her. Sighing, he explains that he couldn't finish school due to his family situation and that he still wants to learn his age. In shock, she thinks he looked older. Suddenly, he grabs her hand. As he approaches, he asks if she can forgive him just this once. With a calm smile, he pleads, "Please." Embarrassed, the teacher says she will. Outside, the driver is watching, wondering if everything is going well, while a child tells their mother that the man looks strange. Later that night, in a place in Jeju, this is a karaoke minibar. A man is drinking, complaining that these Korean drinks are as weak as his henchmen. Nervous, the three say nothing. The leader is eating at a table in front of the trio. One of them says they underestimated those kids. After hearing that, he stops drinking. Irritated, he questions how they dare lose to the Koreans. Then he throws the bottle at the boy's head. Annoyed, he curses them, calling them bastards. Asking if they aren't ashamed, he orders them to bring the boy tomorrow. With his neck hurt and now bleeding from his head, the subordinate says nothing. With a possessed look, the leader asks if he remembers the uniform he's wearing. Sometime later, in another location, Bob Rodney, the driver, approaches a restaurant. He enters the establishment, catching the attention of another man. Raising his hand, he greets him, and the tired driver says it's been a while. The man asks what happened to Jab and mentions he heard he was supposed to be here too. From the Sunshine Group, this is Jeju's branch chief, named Josh Eun, also known as Jo Yun. Nervous, the driver explains that Jab is still with their boss. However, the man questions whether Jab isn't the head of the bodyguards, and Bob responds that they have other reasons. Cutting the topic, Joe suggests they eat first and asks for the table to be prepared. Seeing all the food, Bob is amazed. The man tells him to eat and mentions that it's Jeju fish, so Rodney thanks him. While eating, Bob is overjoyed by the explosion of flavors. Seeing this, the man is pleased too. Then he comments that it must be tough helping such a young boss, but the driver replies that it's not. The man in turn says he heard Derek brought the boy in. Bob says nothing as his mouth is full. Smiling, the man says there's something else. He mentions that Derek said he was beaten by the driver, which makes Bob start choking. Calming the situation, the man says it must be tough and that he should eat while he can. After eating a lot, Bob sighs. Almost bursting, he thanks him for the meal. Then he says that it must be nice. The man doesn't quite understand what he means. Continuing, Bob says it must be nice living in a place with such good food. Hearing this, the man is confused. Suddenly, he begins to smile. Sighing, he says that Jeju used to be great, but now it's being invaded by the Chinese, and there's a lot to do. After hearing that comment, the driver remains silent. Explaining further, the man says the Triad is trying to invade their territory. Confused, Bob says he should notify Peter. Interrupting his thoughts, the man explains that it's not official yet and that they're causing trouble using money, but there haven't been any confrontations so far. Relieved, Bob says it doesn't seem like a big problem then. Arguing, the man says that in a way, he's right, revealing that the head of the Triad is here at this very moment. Rodney doesn't understand what he means by that. Joe says it's just a high school trip, and they notified him to keep an eye on things. Bob says their boss is also on the trip, and everything should be fine, so Joe argues that it's just a school trip and wonders what could possibly happen. Raising a finger, he asks if Bob doesn't want some drinks with sashimi, and excited, Bob explains he has to take care of the boss. With open arms, the man says it's just one drink and that all of his boys are thrilled to see him again. Awkwardly, the driver says it's fine but agrees to just one drink. Sometime later at the hotel, the buses start to arrive. All the students are gathering. Behind a wall, there's one of the Chinese students from that group. On the phone, he informs someone that he found the person and will follow them and report back on what happens. Then the buses start to leave. The teacher says they will hike Mount Hallison and that it will be a great 5-hour trek to the summit and back. Hearing this plan, the students start to groan and the teacher tells everyone to calm down. She explains that if it gets too difficult, they can head back down, but they are strictly prohibited from going anywhere else. The bus arrives at the location. As they get off the buses, one student stretches while another looks downcast. At the same time, a car pulls up. Inside, a man observes the students. On the phone, he begins relaying the location. After getting off the buses, the students start walking. Soon, everyone is having fun, including the protagonists, Sophie, and the other classmates. Among them, the Chinese students are also present. Victor and Brock are walking together. Suddenly, someone appears, catching their attention. It's a large group, and one of them says they are here to get both of them. Seeing this, Victor becomes confused. Elsewhere on the trail, Seth and Sophie are walking and chatting. However, a man appears, catching the boys' attention. He says they need him to follow them. He explains that their boss is waiting for him. The man is with a large group as well. Annoying, Sophie asks what they want this time. The man responds that they aren't here for her and that she should stay quiet. Sophie starts to reply, but the protagonist places his hand on her shoulder, asking her to head back before him, leaving her confused. Meanwhile, the man just waits for a response. Glaring with anger, Seth says it looks like they're here for him. Speaking in Chinese, the man says he wants to get started. Seth wonders what he's saying, not understanding Chinese. The two stare at each other, and Victor prepares for the attack. He tries to throw a right punch, but the big guy quickly dodges. The blonde is shocked by his reflexes. Quickly, the man lands a direct punch to his stomach, not giving him time to dodge. The punch is strong enough to throw him back. However, he manages to prevent himself from falling, starting to feel intense pain in his abdomen. As a result, he drops to his knees and tries to call the man a bastard. But before he can finish the sentence, he collapses on the ground. This catches Brock's attention, leaving him surprised while the protagonist grows furious at the sight. Excited, the Chinese man keeps talking. This disgusts Brock. Then the new student steps forward and begins to walk. With a maniacal look, he calls the man a piece of trash. He quickly charges at the big guy, attempting a kick, but the guy ducks and dodges. The new student is surprised by his speed. He immediately repositions himself for another attack. However, a fist approaches his face. He barely manages to dodge the blow. Right after, he prepares to counterattack. But before he can act, the big guy kicks him straight in the chin. In disbelief, the protagonist realizes that the opponent is too fast for his size. After the hit, the man shows a lot of excitement, while the new student readies himself to block the next attack. Deciding to jump back, quickly the big guy throws another kick. But this time, Seth manages to block it, sending him flying back. Even so, he stands firm in the fight. Seeing that he didn't fall, the Chinese man is surprised, and the protagonist comments that he's having fun. Elsewhere, Sophie runs to the teacher. Catching her attention, she begins to explain something, leaving the woman in shock. Nearby, two people are sitting and talking. It's Kim and the driver who are smoking while chatting. But they soon notice something happening. Looking back, the driver asks what's going on. Kim responds that it seems something is happening now. With that, the driver puts out his cigarette, saying he hopes nothing serious has happened. Both of them get up and decide to check out what's going on. In the woods, the fight between Seth and the Chinese leader continues. The hero tries to throw another punch, but the opponent dodges. Next, he attempts a counterattack with an open palm, but the new student manages to dodge again. The two continue fighting intensely, but neither can land a direct hit. Brock watches the fight in shock. The Chinese students also can't believe what they're seeing, as they thought their boss would have finished the fight by now. At one point, the Chinese leader attempts another strike, but it fails this time. Seth smiles, excited as he finally sees an opening. He quickly tries another hit, but the big guy dodges again. Then he starts spinning, attempting to land a hit. His fist comes closer and closer. He strikes the opponent's head with the other hand. However, the protagonist starts laughing. This scares the big guy. He's laughing because he managed to stop the blow by grabbing the opponent's arm. With a maniacal expression, he asks if that's all he's got. Meanwhile, Kim and the driver arrive at the scene and begin observing the fight. Kim is impressed by the intensity of the battle. Bob watches and comments that the fighter is very strong. Then Kim asks if he's really a student, and Bob responds that he almost beat Peter. The man is shocked, and the driver explains that it happened 2 years ago. Nervous, the man stays silent after the response. He then looks back at the fight and comments that the situation is getting complicated. Seeing his arm being held, the Chinese leader starts cursing in his language, calling the boy a little bastard. Quickly, he frees his arm and attempts an immediate counterattack, grabbing the protagonist's wrist. With his free hand, he prepares to throw a punch. Analyzing the situation seriously, the new student gets ready to strike back, but the big guy barely manages to block it. However, the protagonist grabs the opponent's jacket, getting closer and closer. Suddenly, Seth lands a powerful headbutt. The Chinese leader feels intense pain, starting to stagger backward. Seth approaches to finish the fight, but a foot comes near his face before he can deliver the punch. The new student merrily dodges by ducking. After hitting the ground, he somersaults backward to distance himself from the opponent. In shock, he doesn't understand what just happened. Staring at his new opponent, he asks who he is. It's a man wearing sunglasses who tells his companion that he's lost and should step aside. Deeply irritated, the big guy insists that he hasn't finished yet and orders the man to leave. The other man responds that he's already too injured and will have problems if he continues. Enraged, the big guy declares that he can't lose to a Korean. Opening his eyes, he realizes something is about to happen. The protagonist approaches the two, asking again who the man is. But the new opponent dodges the strike. Quickly, Seth turns back toward the big guy and lands another punch right to his face. Seeing this, the Chinese man in sunglasses is shocked. The boy prepares to deliver another blow while the big guy is on the ground, writhing in pain. Behind him, the man in sunglasses gets ready to knock out the protagonist. But Seth notices the movement and manages to grab the man's arm, stopping the attack. In the background, Bob and Kim arrive at the scene. Kim is visibly furious, and Bob just follows. The three face off at this moment. Then, the driver begins pulling something from inside his jacket. It's some kind of strange weapon. Kim also pulls a weapon from inside his sleeve as he walks toward the adversary. Confused, the man with sunglasses asks who they are. The trio is now ready for the fight. Suspicious, the new student remains silent and looks at Kim. The Chinese man with sunglasses also stays quiet. Breaking the silence, the boy says this is a mess. Annoyed, he says that the two are making it look like he lost to that bastard. He then looks at the Chinese man with hatred. The man, in turn, gets a bit nervous. Without hesitation, the boy charges at his new opponent, trying to land another punch. But the man merrily dodges again. Quickly, the protagonist grabs his ponytail with his left hand, pulling his hair hard. Then, with his free right hand, he prepares to strike, landing the punch squarely on the Chinese man's face. The blow is so strong that he starts bleeding profusely and is thrown back, crashing to the ground. After the punch, Seth stares at him. Sometime later at the Sunshine Group headquarters, the uncle and the protagonist are sitting in the room in silence. The man recalls the hero's statement about not causing any trouble, but the boy remains quiet, listening. Looking back, the man reprimands Kim and Bob for not keeping an eye on the boss. Both apologize, saying they're very sorry for that. Continuing the scolding, the man comments that of all the people in the world to fight, it had to be that guy. Arguing, the boy asks if, when someone wants to hit him, he should just run away. In response, the uncle only sighs. Then he thanks the two and reflects that Joe is involved in a big mess. Sometime later, in another building, Joe is sitting in the room, visibly disappointed. He stays silent, observing his two henchmen, who are completely bruised and bandaged after being beaten by the protagonist. The man, in turn, wonders what to do now. Deeply irritated, the big guy says in Chinese that he won't forgive them. Once again, Joe wonders what he should do. The ponytailed Chinese man declares that he won't leave the Sunshine Group alone. Completely desperate, Joe again asks himself what to do about this whole situation. Meanwhile, at Yeongjin High School, Seth is sulking, looking a bit upset. He spins the pen in his hand, sitting completely alone in the classroom. At the same time, in the boxing gym, Brock is training, hitting the punching bag. He punches harder and harder, completely focused on his boxing. In the background, someone else is training too. It's Victor, who's incredibly angry, recalling the fight he had with the big guy where he was easily defeated. Gritting his teeth, he starts having an outburst of rage. He then looks at the punching bag, directing all his frustration toward it. Determined, he continues training, more focused than ever on getting stronger. Meanwhile, back in the classroom, after finishing her lesson, the teacher announces she has some news. She informs the class that they'll have a new student as the students murmur again, and in her mind, the teacher wonders why all the new students end up in her class. Looking toward the door, she says the new student may come in. It's a new girl, and as she walks into the room, everyone is instantly captivated by her. The teacher explains that she's from Japan and that everyone should treat her with respect and kindness. Quickly, all the students, especially the boys, are enchanted by her. Introducing herself, the girl says her name is Akira. Then she looks at the protagonist with a rather suspicious smile. The boy grows very suspicious but says nothing, only observing her in return. Elsewhere, a phone starts ringing. Someone approaches to answer it. It's the leader of Santu Nikai, who, upon answering, asks how it went. The other line responds that the girl successfully entered the school. Happy, the man says to make sure she handles things quietly. He then thinks that if the boy disappears, Korea will be all theirs. Meanwhile, at Yeongjin High School, the girl is already seated at her desk and Sophie is just watching. She thinks that Akira is very beautiful and looks like a doll. The new girl is just watching something. Curious, Sophie begins to wonder what she's looking at. Then, tracing her line of sight, she realizes she's staring at the protagonist. Shocked, Sophie wonders if the new girl is already interested in Seth. Akira notices that she's being watched. Smiling sadistically, she looks back at Sophie. Sophie is incredibly uncomfortable with the situation. Quickly, she walks over to the protagonist's desk. Grabbing his arm, she asks if he wants to go to the cafeteria, explaining that they should go there and grab something delicious. This sudden suggestion confuses Seth. Then the two begin to leave the classroom. Calmly, the new girl just watches them. A car arrives at the school. Bob and Kim are sitting across from each other smoking. The driver sighs, trying to make small talk. Disheartened, Kim says they don't have much choice. He recalls when Seth got very angry about having bodyguards placed in his classroom and ordered them to be removed. Sadly, he says at least Seth can stay with the driver. Laughing, the man says it's better than being alone. Soon, the two start laughing together. Changing the subject, Kim asks if Bob knows something. This piques Bob's curiosity. He then begins explaining why he wanted to go to school so badly. Meanwhile, in the school courtyard, Akira is walking toward the couple. This startles Sophie. Smiling, Akira asks where Sophie was, saying she's been looking for her. Greeting her, she says she heard Sophie is the class president and admits she's not very used to Korea, asking if they can be friends. Sophie hesitantly agrees. Looking at the boy, Akira asks if he's her boyfriend and Sophie begins to stammer. Being completely direct, Seth says he is indeed her boyfriend. This shocks Sophie. Interested, Akira asks if that's really true. Standing up, the hero tells them to enjoy themselves and says he's leaving. However, suddenly, he stops walking. He looks back at the girl. Akira asks why he's leaving now. Seth responds that he has other things to take care of at the moment. He then starts walking away from them. Blushing and incredibly happy, Sophie thinks about what he said earlier regarding them being a couple. Later that night, at his mother's cafe, she asks what he was doing there since it's been a while since he last visited, and he responds that he was on a school trip. His mother says she already knew that. After a while, he finishes his coffee. Then Seth calls his mother over for a conversation. He mentions that today a transfer student from Japan arrived. Interested, his mother says the girl must be pretty and remarks that it's the first time he's been attracted to a girl, asking him to tell her who he's interested in. Dodging the question, the boy says that's not it. He adds that there's something strange about the girl. Curious, his mother asks what that might be. Reluctantly, the new student begins to reveal that the girl gives off the same vibe as his mother. This leaves the woman both surprised and uncomfortable. The protagonist begins to question if it's just his imagination. Looking to the side, his mother remains silent, visibly irritated. Back at school, someone opens the door to the rooftop. It's Akira, who is there silently observing something. She begins to wonder how she should get rid of him. Sensing something strange, Seth looks up. However, he doesn't see anything at all. Realizing she could be spotted, Akira quickly runs, completely leaving the protagonist's line of sight. She smiles, thinking that he's not entirely useless. Lifting her skirt, she reveals several hidden weapons. Then she tosses 2 thigh straps to the ground. Approaching them, she begins to pull out a weapon. It's some sort of bizarre needle. With a terrifying look, she mutters that maybe she can explore a bit of Korea if she finishes this mission quickly. Suddenly, someone appears in the background saying the lineage continues, startling Akira. The woman says that if Akira leaves now, she'll pretend nothing happened. Seth's mother asks the girl what she thinks of that offer. Quickly, Akira turns around. She throws her needle toward the woman. The weapon slowly approaches her head. Without concern, the woman catches the needle, sighing, "It was too easy." Seeing this, Akira begins to sweat nervously. The woman says she'll also let this behavior slide. With a terrifying gaze, she says Akira looks quite young and asks what she plans to do. Very nervous, Akira asks who this woman is, reaching the conclusion that she needs to get out of here quickly. Her needle gets closer to her head. She barely dodges the object, but it still grazes her cheek, leaving a small cut. Looking to the side, Akira notices something coming her way. Seth's mother charges at her with full force. She's about to land a kick. The blow hits Akira, but it only grazes her hair, leaving the girl in shock. The woman says nothing, only observing. Akira, witnessing the immense power of the woman, is unsure what to do. At that moment, the woman reaches out her hand toward the girl's face. With a piercing look, she grabs Akira's cheek, asking if she's not good at listening, causing the girl to cry in fear. Meanwhile, back in the classroom, the teacher asks why so many students are absent. In the background, a student arrives just in time. It's Kim, scratching his head and apologizing for being late. The teacher, a bit embarrassed, tells him to take his seat. She continues addressing the class, saying they're going to have another fun day. Stith is surprised to see Kim. Quickly, he grows irritated as well. The two stand face to face in the school courtyard. The boy says he told his uncle he didn't want Kim coming back to the school. But Kim apologizes, explaining that he asked Seth's uncle for permission to return to school. This response leaves the boy confused. The man explains that he genuinely wants to attend school. As he begins to kneel, he says Seth's uncle asked him to seek permission from the boy, but Seth stops him from kneeling, telling him to just stay out of his way. This surprises his subordinate. Seth continues, explaining that he doesn't want a bodyguard, but a friend. Lowering his head, Kim says thank you. However, Seth grabs his jacket, telling him that if he's going to be so formal, he should disappear. Nervous, the man begins to sweat profusely. Then the boy tells him to relax. After the conversation, Seth begins walking away. The man just watches and eventually smiles. Back on the rooftop, Akira is very nervous. She starts to look behind her. The woman tells her not to even think about running. With a chilling aura, she orders Akira to take her to the leader right now. In the classroom, the teacher is explaining the lesson. In the back, the boy is just trying to catch some sleep. Later, he lifts his head. Bored out of his mind, the time slowly passes. The teachers switch and the lesson continues. Finally, the day comes to an end. Seth is exhausted from the monotonous routine. He stands up to finally leave. In the background, Sophie watches him, worried about how he's acting. Outside, the protagonist heads toward his car. Bob welcomes his boss, asking where he'd like to go, and the boss responds that he wants to head to his mother's cafe. Sometime later, they arrive at the location. However, Seth sees something that leaves him slightly confused. It's a sign saying the cafe is closed due to personal reasons. With that, he quickly grabs his phone. He decides to call his mother, but she doesn't answer, with a message saying the number cannot be reached at the moment. The boy thinks something doesn't seem right. Back with the two, Akira is very nervous about the woman's presence. She then takes her to the place where her leader is. The lady tells her to stay here without thinking of escaping, and she simply obeys. Upon arriving, the woman begins to open the door. She sees two men in formal attire. One of them says this area is restricted, and she replies that she's here to see the boss. The bald man then asks which gang she belongs to. Annoyed, she says she can't waste time talking to him. Then she glares at them angrily. Both men are startled by her expression. The bald man begins to reach for something inside his jacket. However, there's no time as the lady quickly knocks both of them out. They both fall hard to the ground. After the blow, the bald man is badly hurt and irritated. He quickly pulls out a device from his jacket and presses a red button. The lady continues walking to meet the boss. She reaches a room and opens the door. Inside, she sees a man in a fully tattooed kimono who asks who she is. The lady remains silent. Irritated, the man asks if she's going to answer. In response, he snaps his fingers to call his associates. Several men armed with blades appear. On the other side, there are also several men, but this time with firearms. He questions what a woman is doing alone in a place like this. Reacting to his comment, the lady just sighs. With a murderous aura, she says that anyone who attacks her with those weapons better be prepared to die. Just that response leaves the man completely terrified. The conversation continues, and she reveals who she really is. She tells them to pay close attention because they're after her son. The tattooed man stays silent, listening. Frustrated, the lady starts adjusting her tie, asking if they're ready to begin. Sometime later at the boxing gym, Victor and Brock are training. Both seem tired from the workout. Moving in, the big guy prepares to throw a punch. He tries to land a right hook. The blonde dodges. He readies his counterattack with a left punch. The big guy manages to block it as well. However, quickly the blonde's right arm moves toward his head. He lands a punch on his face, but Brock also manages to hit the blonde's face. It feels like a tie. Victor steps back after the hit. Both stare at each other, wondering what to do next. In the background, someone asks why they haven't gone to school. They both look curiously at the question. It's Seth, saying he missed them. He says it looks fun and asks if he can join. Both look seriously and say nothing. Brock starts taking off his gloves. Then he steps off the ring, drawing the attention of both. Confused, the new student asks if he's not going to fight. The big guy tells him to wait because he's going to beat him up soon. The boy just smiles in response. Then the blonde throws his gloves toward him, asking what he's doing and telling him to put on the gloves and get in the ring. He asks if boxing looks easy, just because he knows how to fight. Upon hearing the provocation, the boy just smiles back. Then he decides to pick up the blue gloves from the floor. Victor begins to explain that they'll do 4 rounds of 3 minutes each, and he'll make sure the boy begs for mercy. With the gloves on, the boy says they should get started. Inside the ring, the protagonist starts trying to dodge the punches. The blonde tries to land a left punch, but Seth dodges it with a smile. Victor prepares for another strike, aiming for a right punch this time. But the newbie dodges again. At this point, the blonde realizes something's coming. Seth tries to land another punch, but the blonde blocks it. In his mind, he wonders what this kid is. After the punch, the boy steps back. They're somewhat distant from each other in the ring. The blonde is starting to get out of breath. He questions why Seth is so strong. Staring at him, the hero remains excited by this. However, Victor begins to get angry, saying boxing isn't the same as a street fight, calling the boy a bastard. He quickly charges forward and the fight continues. Meanwhile, back at the dojo, suddenly a group of men goes flying, breaking through the doors. Seeing this scene, another group starts sweating nervously. She simply defeated several men around her. This left everyone very scared as she seemed to be just an ordinary old lady. One brave man charges at her with his sword. However, he quickly gets punched in the face. He falls hard to the ground, joining the others. A bald man also charges, shouting for her to die. Reflexively, the woman looks back. The bald man is holding a sword, ready to stab her. However, he ends up hitting something else. Shocked, he realizes he struck his companion instead. The lady had used one of the fallen henchmen as a human shield. Furious, she gets ready to punch again, but the woman's hand approaches his face. Without mercy, she strikes both of his eyes. With great force, she begins to push them, throwing the bald man to the ground as well. Without hesitation, she glares at everyone around her with a murderous aura. After that, she begins to stand up. Nervous, everyone starts to watch her carefully. Behind her, a man with a gun tells her not to move. Another one then starts to shout. He rushes at the woman with a blade. He tries to land a direct hit on her, but the woman dodges by ducking down. Quickly, she sweeps the man's legs, throwing him upward. In that moment, she notices the knife one of them used earlier. She kicks it. The knife is launched towards the man with the gun. With great force, it strikes him straight in the chest, piercing him. Meanwhile, the lady has already taken down another one. With one hand, she grabs his sword, delivering the fatal blow to another opponent, or defeating them with just one sword strike. She is now covered in blood, but still doesn't say a word. Looking down at the body of the man she just defeated. After all this humiliation, she finally speaks. Just by opening her mouth, everyone around her becomes terrified. With a murderous aura, she says she will slit the throat of anyone who tries to stop her. Elsewhere, two men are talking. The blonde man questions why they aren't having a drink. In response, the other says the ambassador has no reason to drink with a prosecutor. However, the man says they've been friends since university, and that good friends can share a drink. But the other tells him not to say nonsense and asks what the real reason for the visit is. Then he asks if Sophie hasn't told him. He explains that it's about his school as he placed his brother in charge, and the thieves took it from him. However, the man responds that there's nothing illegal about that. Irritated, the blonde man asks if he's saying they should leave things as they are. However, his friend asks what he wants. In a fit of rage, the blonde man says he wants everyone to know who they mess with. The prosecutor responds that there's nothing illegal about the Sunshine Company, and that even if they investigate, they won't find anything. The other laughs, saying they're a group of gangsters, and that they'll know their place once they find someone stronger. Then the prosecutor says they won't find anyone willing to go against the Sunshine Group, and the ambassador responds that maybe not in Korea, but he sent his brother to Japan to clean up the mess. Hearing this, the man remains silent. Soon after, the ambassador continues, saying that it must be the biggest gang in Japan. Confused and irritated, the man asks what he's trying to do. Excited, he responds that he doesn't want to make it a big problem, and that he just wants to get rid of a few people. Then the other starts to rise from the table, saying he follows the law. As he leaves, he comments that he'll pretend he didn't hear any of this. Hearing that, the ambassador starts to get very angry. Cursing him, he says that he made him a public prosecutor, and that this is how he repays him. Back at the dojo, the massacre is over. The lady is somewhat relieved after all of this. Even defeating a tattooed man who was covered in scars. Sitting in front of the painting of Japan, the old man just watches, asking what is happening. Confused, he wonders who this woman is. His eyes widen as he sees something coming. It's the lady who noticed the man's movement. She charges with a sword. Then she strikes directly at the painting of Japan. The old man is terrified, realizing he was nearly hit by the sword. With a frightening aura, the woman says that if he ever touches her son again, she will surely kill him. Sometime later at the protagonist's school, with crossed arms, he looks upset about something. Sophie is very worried, looking at him. At that moment, the bell signaling the end of class starts ringing through the megaphone. Seth begins to rise from the table, and Sophie heads toward him. She calls for his attention, saying that he doesn't need to go to school today, then asks if he wants to eat something. With a friendly smile, he replies that he's sorry, but he needs to go somewhere else right now. He begins to leave, and the girl is left confused. He tells her that he'll buy her something nice next time, and that he's sorry. In silence, she just watches him without saying anything. Outside the school, Seth walks to his car. Then his driver asks if he wants to return. The protagonist tells them to head to his mother's cafe. Upon arriving, the boy steps out of the car. Entering the cafe, he's surprised to see his mother doing well. She says hi and asks if he had fun at school. Perplexed, the boy asks where she was. She responds, saying she had some things to take care of, then asks if he was worried, and the boy says it's obvious he was. Soon he notices someone else in the place. He points a finger and asks if she is who he thinks she is. His mother, explaining, says that the girl will be working part-time, and that she heard they were classmates. But Seth just leaves, staring without understanding anything. He looks at the girl in a friendly way. He asks if she'll be back tomorrow, and she confirms that she will. Seeing this, the protagonist can't believe the coincidence. At the same time, somewhere else in the city, a scarred man asks what he's saying. This is the boss of the great three-headed phantom, Midoki Ryonosuke. The man arrives with a briefcase. He places it on the table, then opens it, revealing a large amount of money. The boss stays silent, looking at the money. He responds that it won't be easy to get rid of Sunshine. Then the blonde man asks what he means by that. He explains that they follow rules and are on the same side. Confused, the blonde doesn't understand anything he said. Continuing, Midoki says that's not the important part, and asks what they can do for his group. The man replies that their boss said he would help them do business in Korea. Observing, the boss says that opening businesses is something they can do too. At that moment, the blonde man asks what he wants, and the leader says he wants something that makes a lot of money. For example, helping to transport goods to Korea, and if they do that, they'll handle the rest. This response leaves the man shocked. Responding again, Ryonosuke says they'll undo the Sunshine Group's business, and that the man stands to benefit the most. Smiling, he says he'll give them plenty of time to decide. Glancing at the psychopath, he invites him to try the hot springs. Meanwhile, in Jeju, someone is beating Josh Yun. He's been beaten in every possible way, completely battered and exhausted. Suddenly, someone arrives at the scene. This is the branch manager of the black group Mandoy, whose name is John Lee. Jian just stares at the man, completely broken. Jian tells him that even though he's from the black group, he asks if it isn't boring to do this all the time. And his man responds that if that's how he feels, he shouldn't have said so. He quickly states that he's not here to negotiate with the group, and asks again where the man who hit his brother is. At night, at the Sunshine Group, inside the president's office, the uncle is watching. He seems somewhat thoughtful. Suddenly, the phone starts ringing. He goes to it and picks it up. Answering, Joey starts to contact him. At that moment, the uncle is surprised by the call, lying on the ground being held by a bald man. He begins to speak. One of the men from the group takes Joey's phone, then orders them to bring the man who hit his brother, because if they don't, they'll destroy the group. Hearing this, the uncle starts to get angry. He then asks who is speaking on the other side of the line. The man says he's the leader of the Manhwa's group, named John Lee. In response, the uncle says that from now on, if he dares to lay a hand on Joey, he won't leave Korea alive. Hearing this, the man asks what he's talking about. At the same time, a little bird perches on a tree near the school. Seth watches calmly. Few people have arrived in the classroom so far. Opening the door, Akira enters the classroom. Looking at the protagonist, he suddenly stands up from his desk, walking in her direction. As he approaches the girl, he says he needs to talk to her. They both start climbing the stairs. Meanwhile, Sophie follows them, because it's Seth and Akira, and she asks where the two are going. She is hiding behind the door leading to the rooftop. Peeking through the crack, she says she shouldn't be following them. Annoyed, he asks what she's looking for. Nervous, Akira questions what he means by that. The protagonist explains that it's strange and asks how she ended up at his mother's cafe. The girl replies that it just happened. Not believing her, he asks if he looks like an idiot, asking what relationship she has with his mother. Cornered, she says nothing. And that alone irritates the protagonist a lot. Trembling all over, the girl begins to answer. Crying, she says it's because his mother is causing trouble. Still peeking through the cracks, Sophie is shocked. Besides her, the hero himself is also in shock. Appearing on the rooftop, Sophie calls out to the boy. When he sees who's there, he's also very confused. Meanwhile, back at the dojo, Ryugo arrives and opens the door. He wonders why no one is guarding the gang's entrance. Then he opens the door, calling for Ryujin. But he's shocked when he sees. Sitting on the ground, the old man is silent. As he walks in, the man asks what happened. Smiling, the old man questions what he's doing here. Ryunosuke responds that he has a favor to ask of the Chan gang, because they need to get rid of Sunshine. Sweating and nervous, the old man responds that not here. This response leaves the man very confused. Trembling with fear, the old man tells him to do whatever he wants, because they've finished with them. Annoyed by the response, Midou just stays silent. At the school headquarters, all the students are leaving. Sophie walks calmly. However, she comes across something that catches her attention. It's the captains and club leaders who want to recruit. The captain of the Taro Kendo Club, the head of the Judo Club, Sam Choi, the head of the wrestling club, Damien Cha, and the head of the Kendo Club, Scott Choi. Irritated, he asks what they want. Yu calls him arrogant, telling him to just be quiet and follow. Hearing this response, the protagonist starts laughing. Then a guy with a crazy expression. Watching everything from the window is Jason, the student council president. Deeply irritated, he asks if the protagonist thinks he'll let things stay like this. Sometime later, inside the gym, even surrounded by the four captains, the protagonist remains calm, asking what they want. Annoyed, Gabe calls him an arrogant bastard. Bothered by the comment, Seth asks why he's being called arrogant and asks if he did something. In response, the man says he has a big mouth and is acting arrogant just because he beat Brock. Entering the conversation, Sam Choi says things are quite complicated and that the upperclassmen hold grudges against the new student. With crossed arms, he reveals that there are rumors the upperclassmen are very scared. Unfazed, the boy asks if they're all going to gang up and fight. This makes you even more irritated, asking how the newbie dares speak to a superior like that. Changing his expression, he says he's warning them. If they keep bothering him, he warns that he might kill their superiors. He calls him a bastard. Suddenly, Scott steps in, telling his companion to wait. At this point, the protagonist is already annoyed. Smiling, the head of the Kendo group says they won't attack together because they're not bad guys, suggesting that the newbie face him first. In response, the hero says nothing. But soon after, he's already on the mat. Scott says it's not safe to fight barehanded, saying the boy should understand that. With his hands in his pockets, the boy says it's fine because it's not the first time he's fought like this. Hearing this, Scott asks what he means. Deeply irritated, he states that the boy is truly arrogant. Suddenly, the leader charges at him. The wooden sword approaches his face. However, Kang dodges. Quickly, Scott changes the direction of the strike. The hero swiftly dodges by crouching down, now close to his opponent's legs. Excited, he just smiles sadistically. While the Kendo Club leader is struggling, someone is watching everything from the background. It's Jason, who curses the four of them as stupid bastards and says he told them all to attack the boy immediately. Someone appears by his side. Turning his face, the president is startled. Looking at Kim, he asks who he is. With arms crossed, Bob says this is the gym where the boss was, and that scares Jason. Continuing the conversation, Kim says that fights are always fun to watch. Confused, Jason starts to get even more irritated. Back to the previous fight. Kang manages to land a solid punch on his opponent, strong enough to break the wooden sword. After the hit, the opponent begins to fall. At that moment, the newbie senses someone coming. It's Yu from Taekwondo arriving with a flying kick. However, the boy easily dodges. Then he bumps his back into someone. It's Damien Shaw, the head of the wrestling club, who grabs him forcefully, saying that they didn't call them here to play sports. Looking back, Kang gets irritated. Gabe approaches, saying they're going to mess him up badly. Excited, the boy says that sounds good. Quickly, he headbutts Damien's nose with the back of his head, grabbing the blonde by his jacket. Surprisingly, he throws him towards Yu, who reflexively dodges his companion's body. He had to put in a lot of effort to avoid it. Suddenly, he realizes the hero is coming. Seth moves in to deliver a powerful punch, landing a punch right in the middle of Gabe's face. It's a punch so strong it knocks the man down to the floor. After this hit, he stares at the remaining two. Seeing this, the head of the judo club and the head of the kendo club become frightened. Along with them, Jason also can't believe what he's seeing. Happy, Kim comments that Seth is holding back against the students, and Bob says that during his fight with Mako's hammer, Seth broke all his teeth. Then Kim asks if he remembers Axe, who had his eye messed up by Seth, and laughing, Rodney responds that he does and that he almost wet his pants. Laughing hard, he says the boy basically destroyed Axe, and that he was just a bit smaller at that time. Recalling the story, Kim mentions that Axe used knives, but even that wasn't enough to win. Bob says he would have had to choose the right weapon, which surprises his colleague. While listening to everything, Kim begins to sweat. The student council president has a defeated expression on his face. Gabe Yu has been completely defeated. Seth looks down at his opponent. As he stares at him, he smiles like a madman. But he quickly changes his expression and looks to the side, glaring at the judo club head, who, after seeing all this, is extremely nervous and terrified. Trembling, he says he didn't want to fight the boy, but the newbie tells him to come attack already. Suddenly, he starts to sigh. With a terrifying aura, he warns them to leave him alone from now on. Then he turns to leave. However, someone calls his name and he stops. Turning around, wanting to know who it is, it's Kim waving for his boss, while the driver Bob looks concerned. Reacting to this, Jason gets nervous. Frightened, Rodney calls his partner a crazy bastard. Confident, he replies that he's just a classmate. They keep calling out to him. Kim thinks the president sent those guys and asks what they should do now. Instantly, the hero glares and remains silent. Avoiding eye contact, Jason gets even more nervous. Quickly, Seth responds that they should just leave him, as he's just an idiot. Patting the president on the shoulder, Kim says he's lucky because his boss is giving him an opportunity. Rodney assumes that Jason doesn't have the courage to fight against his boss. Soon after, they start to move away, leaving the student council president alone. Sometime later, in another place, opening the door, the uncle looks serious. He enters an unknown place and descends the stairs, arriving to meet the leader, the one he was talking to earlier on the phone. They face each other without any friendliness. At this moment, he sees his colleague who has been suffering, deciding to go toward him. However, two men stand in his way, preventing him. Annoyed, the uncle orders them to step aside. In silence, the bald men do nothing. Staring at the leader, he asks if he came alone. Responding, he tells the two men to move now if they don't want to die. At that moment, the leader orders the bald men to step aside, clearing the way for the uncle to continue his path. Kneeling in front of his partner, he asks if he's okay. Battered, he smiles, saying he can manage, but asks him to keep it a secret because the situation is embarrassing. In response, the uncle remains silent. From afar, the leader asks why he's complicating things so much over a mere student. Still kneeling, he replies that the reason is that he's not just any student and warns that he'll let the leader live since he didn't hurt Joe any further. Hearing this, the leader becomes extremely angry. As he stands up, the uncle says that his courtesy toward the Black Mandua's group ends right here. In turn, the man says that Sunshine is big in Korea, but it's a small company compared to the rest of the world. At that moment, the uncle asks if he got permission from his boss and if he knows what kind of company Sunshine is. Very irritated, the man responds that this is a personal matter. However, the uncle tells him to ask his boss and says that if he wants a war, then he will get one with pleasure. Raising his voice, the leader states that he came to take the boy who beat his brother and asks why he's complicating things. Taking off his glasses, the uncle comments that the boy he's referring to is the same one who left his face like this. Seeing his opponent's face, the man is surprised. In fury, he says that if the uncle wants to meet the boy, he must beat him first. Curious, the man stays silent. Concluding, the uncle says that if he loses, he'll go home and never return to this place. Breaking the silence, the man lets out a laugh. Expressing anger, he says he'll also set a condition. Then he calls out to the bald twins, Jay and Ho. He explains that if the uncle defeats both of them, then he'll fight. Still without his glasses, the uncle remains silent, staring at them. The bald men do the same. Suddenly, the two rush at him simultaneously. One prepares to land an open-hand strike, while the other gets ready to punch. They hit an open-hand strike and a punch to the stomach, respectively. But feeling no impact, the uncle just glares with hatred. Both bald men are shocked and scared by this. Quickly, a fist moves toward one of their faces. It lands a punch square in the middle of his face. With the force of the impact, the bald man is thrown backward. Agilely, the uncle shifts direction, grabbing the other bald man by the neck. With impressive strength, he lifts the muscular man by his throat, squeezing tightly. This terrifies the leader, who doesn't understand what's happening. With an expression of indignation, the uncle stares at the bald man until the end. However, he decides not to finish him off, throwing the man forcefully into the drawers. The leader then claps, saying the uncle is strong, asking if that boy really beat him. Standing up from the couch, he walks toward the uncle. The two stare at each other. With a fearless look, the uncle mentions the term in a you and chum, asking if the man knows what that means. Seething with rage, the uncle remains silent. Losing it, the leader shouts that it means there's always someone better than the best. Suddenly, he charges at his opponent, delivering an elbow strike, strong enough to push the large man backward. Pleased with the result, the leader laughs. However, he quickly realizes something is wrong. Seeing that his opponent is still standing, mocking, the uncle asks if that's all he's got. Surprised, the man wonders how the hit didn't even hurt. Then the uncle questions the saying better than the best, saying that's what they call a frog in a well. Suddenly, someone yells for them to stop. Both fall into complete silence. A man walks up to the two who are fighting. He respectfully greets the uncle, saying his boss sends his regards. Irritated, the leader asks why he's there. At that moment, the Chinese man Chun starts whispering. After hearing him, the leader gets even more irritated. Apologizing, the man asks for the uncle's forgiveness, and if permitted, they would like to leave, explaining that their boss will want to compensate for this incident. However, the man from Sunshine remains silent without responding. Changing the subject, the uncle says they won't be leaving now. As he exits, the leader makes it clear that he'll be back. The uncle then says that next time he comes, he'll kill him, and tells him to deliver that message to his boss. Leaving the scene, the man is extremely irritated by the response. Some time later, at the protagonist's house, he is sleeping deeply. However, his phone starts ringing, waking him up. Still tired, he decides to answer. It's Sophie calling, asking if he wants to hang out, inviting him to go see a movie together. The protagonist quickly accepts, asking if it's right now. She says no because it's still early and suggests 1 o'clock in the afternoon. Very happy, the newbie smiles, saying that sounds great. At the same time, on a highway bus, the hero's mother is reading a book during the trip. Arriving at her destination, the bus stops. Looking back, she tells Kira to hurry up, and the woman comes carrying a suitcase. The girl is still trembling and very nervous. The two women begin to climb a hill, with Kira still carrying her rolling suitcase. Then she sees a snake and gets very scared. The old woman sighs, clearly exhausted. They continue walking through this kind of forest. However, they start to see something. After finishing their climb, they come across a dojo. Kira is exhausted from carrying her suitcase throughout the entire walk. Upon arriving at the place, the older woman begins to open the door. An old man is sitting and looks surprised. Bowing, she addresses him as master, and he asks what brings her here now. Peeking around, the girl asks who this old man is. However, as she looks to the side, she notices that the driver Bob is also there, spying. Surprised, the old woman looks at him, commenting that he's grown a lot and calls him little brother. This leaves the man a bit confused. Then she turns to the girl, grabbing her attention as well, telling her to wait there and do nothing. Nervous, Kira quickly agrees. Back to the protagonist, he arrives at the cinema for his date. Embarrassed, he asks her if he made her wait too long. But Sophie assures him that he didn't and asks if he slept well. Changing the subject, the hero asks his friend if there's something she wants to watch. The two start looking at the posters. Sometime later, Seth is holding posters for a movie called Witch. Meanwhile, Sophie has posters for a movie about a kitten. Showing each other their choices, they both remain silent. Excited, the girl mentions that they haven't watched something like this last time, and suggests they see the kitten movie since she likes cats. Suddenly, someone calls out to her. Lifting her head, she's surprised. It's her father, who is there for some reason. Seemingly calm, he stares at the nudie, who, in turn, has no idea what's going on. Curious, Sophie asks her father why he's here now. Then the man asks if they can watch the movie later and invites them to eat something. The three of them head to what seems to be a conventional restaurant. Sitting at the table, the father tells his daughter not to worry and to eat as much as she wants. Embarrassed, she asks why he's doing this. With a charming smile, he says he just wanted to meet his daughter's boyfriend. She asks if that's the only reason. In turn, the man says it's her first boyfriend and asks what could be more important than that. At that moment, she lowers her head and both go quiet. Seth notices something strange is happening. Her father stared at her with a very odd look. From afar, others could feel the tension at the table. Breaking the silence, the man suggests they all eat. A bit confused, the newbie agrees with the idea. Meanwhile, at the temple, Akira is sitting and waiting. A man walks past her, but the girl avoids eye contact. He tries to look from a different angle, but she turns her head away. Even as he leaves, she tries to see her face. Nervous, the girl asks what's going on. Soon, she notices someone approaching. It's that same man who came to see her again, already bothering her. Frightened, she asks where she is. At the same time, inside the temple, the old man says the girl outside has killed many. Then the woman says she has healing powers as well. Surprised, the man asks if that's true, and the lady says she was hoping to leave the girl in his care for a while. Annoyed, the man responds that he had a purpose. Arguing, she says that everyone has the right to protect the power they were born with. Mocking, the man says the one who said that is the same person who gave up being hair for a man. Hearing this, she remains silent. Bowing, she apologizes. Stroking his beard, he explains that she's the best in training in every way, and that no one is better than her, so she should take care of it. At this, the woman asks if he intends to send his student away from the temple. However, he questions how he could keep him in the mountains. Again, the protagonist's mother says nothing. Staring at her, he says she can go and he will watch over the girl for a few days. Receiving his positive response, she begins to rise. Thanking him, she bows to her master. Back to the meeting between the future son-in-law and father-in-law, both remain quiet at the table. Irritated, the newbie says if he has something to say, he should just say it already, mentioning that he didn't send Sophie away for nothing. In response, the father says that the boy knows what he does. This leaves the boy completely confused. Smiling, the father explains that what he does isn't that important. Getting irritated again, he makes it clear that the protagonist's identity is far more important. Sophie stays completely silent after the comment. Continuing, the father says he heard that Seth is the heir to the Sunshine Group and that 90% of Korea's companies work for his company. The newbie is somewhat surprised, but still says nothing. Surprisingly, the man says he won't reveal this to his daughter, which leaves Seth completely shocked. However, he explains that if his daughter stays with him, she could be in danger. At that moment, he pulls something out of his jacket. It's a photo, which he places on the table. The photo contains 3 individuals, and he explains it was taken at Incheon Airport. He comments that he's only helping for one reason and that this will be the last time. Standing up, he says that if there's even the slightest chance his daughter is in danger, Sunshine will disappear without a trace. After saying that, he simply leaves. Holding the photo, the protagonist looks at it. Something feels very wrong about this situation. Sophie arrives, noticing that her father is no longer there, and heads toward the newbie, who calls her over. At that moment, he crumples the photo so she can't see it. Curious, the girl asks where her father went. Trying to stay polite, Seth explains that her father said something important came up and he had to leave. Saying this, he hides the photo in his pocket. Completely irritated, she questions why her father embarrassed her, and then left, as now they can't watch the movie. Quickly, Seth suggests they go watch it now. Delighted by the comment, she asks if they really can, and the boy replies yes. Taking her hand, Sophie tells him to hurry. Both are very happy with the date. However, the protagonist still feels something is off. After the movie, they're walking and she asks if the film wasn't wonderful, to which Seth responds that it was good. At that moment, she blushes and starts to laugh. Then she says she can go home alone from here. Feeling very happy, she thanks him for watching the movie together. In response, the boy says he had fun too. Sophie says goodbye, telling him she'll see him tomorrow. They wave at each other. Soon, she heads home. Quickly, his ride arrives. Trembling, the boy grabs his phone. He decides to call his uncle. At the hospital, his uncle is watching over Joey, unaware of his phone ringing. He's staring at his companion, who is severely injured. However, it's impossible to see his reaction because of his sunglasses. The call goes unanswered. Frustrated, the boy calls for his driver. Throwing the crumpled photo to him, he asks him to identify who the people are. With great skill, Bob catches the photo, opening it and smoothing it out. Upon seeing the picture, he is startled and shocked. Not understanding, Seth asks if he recognizes these people. Bob confirms that he does. Very irritated, the newbie questions who they are. Beginning to explain, Bob says they are part of one of the biggest gangs in Japan, called the Three-Headed Phantom Gang, and that the people in the photo are the worst of the 3 heads, including the leader of the main gang. His name is Meduki Ryunosuke. At the same time, elsewhere, an old man is deep in thought. Those 2 Chinese leaders are completely defeated. Turning around, the elder explains that he had already told them not to be reckless. This is the head of the Black Group, part of the Mandu gang. His name is Meng Lei. This leader is, in fact, his son. He explains that his brother was humiliated. Retorting, Meng Lei says that this stupid incident isn't enough for him to attack Sunshine. Confused, his son asks if this is just a stupid incident. Suddenly, his father yells, calling him an idiot, which leaves him completely startled. He asks if he doesn't know why the gang has left Korea alone all this time. Perplexed, the man asks if the Sunshine Group is really that big. His father then explains that the Sunshine Group isn't the real problem. The problem is that she is there. Returning to the past, he begins to explain. He is gathered around many people. As he stares at another man, likely his opponent, suddenly, someone appears atop a shipping container. Looking up, the man becomes very nervous. Then a woman arrives along with his opponent on a night with a full moon. She has a very strong presence along with a dangerous look. Just remembering this makes the old man tremble nervously as he runs his hand over a scar, which was likely caused by her. After that, he begins pacing around the room, placing a hand on his son's shoulder, who was previously irritated. With a serious look, Meng Lei suggests that his son avoid stepping foot in Korea for now. This suggestion leaves his son very confused. After that, Meng Lei begins to leave the room. At the school, the big guy apologizes to his brother, saying it's his fault. But his brother reassures him that it's not his fault at all. Still feeling beaten and regretful, the big guy expresses his anger and says he'll do whatever it takes to get revenge, telling him to trust in him. The next day at school, Seth seems a bit troubled by something. He's sitting on the couch talking to someone. In his mind, he recalls his father-in-law's words. If there's even the slightest chance she's in danger, sunshine will disappear without a trace. Remembering that phrase makes him extremely irritated. Someone is outside that room, just observing. It's the person who's been deep in thought. In a flashback, Bob tells Kim that some guys are following their boss and Jake isn't answering, asking Kim to keep an eye on Seth until Jake returns. Fidgeting with his weapon, the man thinks about this. Quickly, he gives a strange smile. Casually, he says he always does this. Back in the present, he continues watching his boss. However, the boy seems to have improved and noticed. Looking out the window, Seth comments that the weather is really nice today. Outside the school, two men are walking. Victor asks if he's alright and says he can handle it if he can't. Brock remains silent. Both have very serious expressions as they walk. Inside the school in the principal's office, he doesn't seem to be doing anything. Suddenly, someone starts knocking on the door, startling him and snapping him out of his trance. Opening the door, it's Brock and Victor. The former teacher, now the principal, is surprised by their arrival. The big guy gets straight to the point, saying they're here to ask for a favor. Back in the protagonist's room, the principal is calling through the phone. Hearing this, Seth is extremely confused. The same goes for Sophie, who also doesn't understand anything. Continuing the call, the principal tells him to come to the gym before lunch ends. Hearing this, the protagonist feels uneasy, suspecting something is up. He quickly gets up from his desk as the girl watches. She seems very worried about what might happen. However, the newbie keeps moving forward. With a murderous aura, he's deeply irritated, walking past Kim without saying a word. His subordinate, however, continues watching in silence. At the gym, the principal is also there and sees Kim arrive. All three observe the protagonist. Brock tells them to get started. Confused, the newbie says nothing, but he stares directly at the principal, asking what all of this means after all. Explaining, the man says the big guy wants a rematch and asks what Seth thinks of that. However, the newbie just continues to stare, giving no response. Intervening, Victor explains that Brock is just asking for a rematch and asks if Seth isn't the type to run from a fight. Smiling, he tries to provoke the boy. Seth smiles back, saying Victor is right. With a maniacal expression, Seth says it doesn't matter what the reason is. Kim heads toward the gym as well to see what's going on. He arrives to continue his observation in total secrecy. Meanwhile, the new student is stretching. This is right when the principal tries to hand in gloves. However, the newbie insists he doesn't need them, saying that wearing them makes it feel like they're playing a sport. This catches the principal's attention, as it is indeed a sport. He explains that there are rules. Seth tells him not to worry, as there won't be anything for him to be responsible for. Casually, with his hands in his pockets, he walks up to his opponent. Irritated, he says he's been waiting and lunch is almost over. Focused, Brock stares back, ready to start the fight. Quickly, he goes for the first strike. However, the new student has been patiently waiting for this very moment. He dodges with ease. Seeing this, the big guy is very surprised. Trying to counter, the new student also throws a right punch, but his opponent manages to dodge it. At that moment, the two stare at each other. Then they continue their seemingly ruleless fight. Elsewhere, a man in a trench coat and tie tells his boss that they found the person. His boss smiles, saying it's time for them to go, stating that they can't waste any more time. Back to the fight, Brock is very focused, charging forward with everything he has against Seth. Quickly, the boy lands a punch on him, completely altering the trajectory of Brock's strike. He's very excited about this fight. Swiftly, Seth lands a left punch on his opponent's face. The impact sends Brock stumbling backward, losing his balance. However, he still hasn't fallen to the ground. Seeing this resilience, the newbie is surprised. A clenched fist approaches him. Brock attempts a downward punch trying to hit him, but the newbie manages to dodge. The two were in a somewhat balanced fight. Nervously, the principal continues analyzing the fight. He remarks that Brock is indeed strong. Recalling the time when Brock was a first-year student, he managed to defeat all the upperclassmen who came to challenge him. However, the principal grows even more nervous as he thinks about Seth Kang, wondering who the hell he is. Both prepare to throw their next punches. The big guy tries to land a punch, but it's dodged. Seth tries to hit Brock's head, but it's also dodged. With his left hand close to his face, he stares at his opponent. Suddenly, Seth readies his right hand for a punch. Alarmed, Brock notices the movement and tries to do something to defend himself. Kang lands a punch with his left arm, but Brock manages to defend and block it just in time. While blocking, Brock simply observes him. His opponent has a psychotic expression on his face. Suddenly, the bell rings, catching the former teacher's attention. However, Kang continues throwing punches while Brock blocks. Seth is clearly excited by the fight. Intervening, the principal tells them to stop immediately, explaining that lunch is over and they should finish after class. However, Seth doesn't like that idea at all. They lock eyes and Brock is visibly exhausted. Turning away, the newbie begins to leave. Then he calls out to Brock with a smile and says that he'll hear from him soon. This statement leaves Brock shaken. In the background, Victor silently observes their fight. Though quiet, he's certainly nervous about what he's seen. Elsewhere, a man with a scar on his face is on the phone, saying that they're ready. On the other end of the line, the person says they'll take care of the rest, so there's no need to worry. Once it's done, they'll be generously rewarded. The gangster says it's time to get to work. He's sitting in the backseat, with his driver accompanying him. He's in a black car that looks a lot like the protagonist's. However, behind him is a fleet of buses. Holding a cigarette, he says they need to finish this job as quickly as possible. Sometime later at Ancient Airport, the defeated leader starts leaving, accompanied by his brother, who got beaten earlier, along with his brother's henchman, who also took a beating on the same occasion. Holding the photo in his hand, he asks where Alvin is, and the Chinese man with sunglasses responds that he was at a school with a team. Shaking, he looks at the photo of the protagonist. Filled with anger, he mutters, "We lost this time." Meanwhile, inside the school, Sophie is silent, looking back, clearly worried about her romantic interests, Seth. The new student seems troubled by something as well. Outside the school, Bob is smoking. This time he's alone. Suddenly, he notices something strange happening. A car, along with a group of buses, arrives in front of the school. However, they pass right by the place. Seeing this, the driver is confused, wondering what's going on. These men park the buses and cars somewhere a bit nearby. Soon, they exit the vehicles and begin to run. Judging by the number of buses, it seems like a lot of people. Still smoking, Bob silently observes. The henchmen begin to gather to carry out their mission. Their leader then steps out of the car wearing a genuinely happy expression. Seeing this, the driver becomes instantly suspicious. Throwing his cigarette to the ground, Bob approaches and the man notices his presence. Confused, the bald man asks who he is, but Ronnie remains silent. He stands face to face with the bald man along with many other henchmen behind him. Opening his mouth, Ronnie says, "Open up." Perplexed, the man asks what he's talking about. Quickly, the driver moves closer, grabbing the henchman by the shoulder. With a serene and calm expression, he begins pulling the man by his jacket, attempting to slam his head into the fence. The henchman begins to get nervous. Suddenly, Bob pulls something out of his pocket. It seems to be that odd weapon. Instantly, he readies his weapon for the fight. With his demeanor completely changing, he stares down the bald man. With great courage, he decides to leap forward, aiming to clear the fence entirely. While in midair, he ends up hitting his foot on the fence. Realizing this, he becomes anxious, falling headfirst onto the ground. The henchman ends up sprawled in the same way as the man. As he gets up, he complains about the pain and grabs his phone. Kim hears the sound of a notification. Kim grabs his phone to check the message. When he sees the screen, he's very surprised. It's a message from his boss's driver, informing him that they've arrived. Surprisingly, Kim stands up abruptly, making noise. Nervous, the teacher doesn't understand what's happening. With a calm and seductive smile, Kim explains that he needs to go to the bathroom. In the background, the teacher says it's fine. Irritated, he keeps walking without saying another word. Stith, not Nave, begins to suspect something. At the same time, in the school gym, Victor tells Brock that he's going to lose. However, the big guy remains silent, not responding. Continuing, the blonde tells him to step down this time and that he can train more with him. Hearing this, Brock gets very irritated. Saying no, he insists he hasn't tried everything yet, which confuses his colleague. Continuing his explanation, Brock says his specialty is wrestling, and concludes that from now on, he'll fight his way. Out of nowhere, someone kicks the door down. Both are surprised and frightened by the scene. The man who broke the door walks into the gym, carrying a baseball bat, accompanied by several other henchmen. Thinking about it, Brock and Victor just watch angrily. The man gets their attention. Showing them a photo of Seth with Sophie, he asks if this boy is here. The man next to him says that obviously Seth isn't here and suggests they search elsewhere, and offers a reward of 10,000 for whoever finds him. The man agrees and they start to leave. However, one of the students calls out. Turning around, the man asks what they want. Brock asks why they're looking for that boy. Confused, the man with the Vegeta-like hairstyle doesn't understand the question either. Looking to pick a fight, Victor and Brock move toward the men. The henchmen are searching all over the school for the newbie. Many of them are gathering on the first floor. They begin splitting into smaller groups to make the search more efficient. One of the groups starts heading toward a staircase. However, someone shows up to block their path. It's Kim, the now loyal subordinate and friend. Annoyed, he asks what the three-headed phantom gang is doing here. One of the bald men asks who he is. Without hesitation, he replies that he's from Sunshine. Suddenly, Kim leaps into the air. Clearing all the steps in one bound, he lands in front of the henchmen. They're standing very close to each other. Kim comments that he could get expelled from school for this. Quickly, he stabs one of the bald men in the stomach with a knife. Then he gets ready to strike again. Without any mercy, he lands multiple stabs with his weapon. After all the strikes, several men fall to the ground. A flood of blood follows, terrifying those nearby. Kim declares that thanks to them, he'll be expelled from school. In the classroom, the teacher is explaining how to properly translate sentences. Seth is sitting with his eyes closed, listening to side conversations. Sensing that something's wrong, he becomes restless. In the principal's office, the man is slacking off once again. Suddenly, someone kicks the door wide open, startling the man. With a smile on his face, the mobster asks if he's the new principal. Walking into the room with his entire gang, he says it's a pleasure to meet him. In shock, the principal stands up, asking who they are. Taking charge of the situation, one of the henchmen steps forward. Quickly, he appears behind the principal as if he teleported. With one hand, he forces the principal back into his chair. Nervous, the former teacher simply stares, not understanding what's going on. However, the mobster pulls a photo from his pocket to explain everything, demanding that the principal bring this boy immediately. It's a photo of Seth Kang. Confused, the principal repeats the new student's name. The mobster confirms it's him, ordering that they bring him or else he'll die. The principal responds by saying he'll call the police. His trembling hand reaches for the landline phone. Stalking nonchalantly, the mobster asks if the principal knows what will happen if he does that. At the same time, in the Youngjin Jin School boxing gym, Brock asks again why they're looking for the boy. The man with the Vegeta-like hairstyle seems to have heard nothing. The two students remain silent. Suddenly, the man charges forward with the baseball bat, cursing. Without hesitation, Brock lands a punch right in the crazy man's face. Instantly, the man is knocked off balance. Without a second thought, Brock finishes him off with another punch to the face. Seeing this, the other henchmen are in shock. Even Victor is surprised by the strength of Brock's punch. Without fear, the big guy glares at everyone. The henchmen, armed with knives, rush toward the high schooler. Frustrated, Brock yells at them. He grabs one of their faces, squeezing it. Then he starts pummeling everyone around him. Seeing this, Victor gets nervous. He also joins the fight, saying he hates being dragged into this kind of mess. Soon, the two of them start beating down the thugs together like a duo. Back to Kim, who just defeated a lot of henchmen. The remaining ones are getting very irritated. They rush at him, yelling that they're going to kill him. One of them, holding a sword, gets ready to attack. However, Kim dodges easily. He counterattacks, stabbing the man in the neck with his knife. It turns out to be a fatal blow, as the man doesn't get back up. Irritated, Kim wonders when his colleague Rodney will arrive. Outside the school, Rodney, the driver, checks in on the situation. After being attacked by several people, he says they just keep coming. He expresses concern for Kim, but is also worried about Seth, their boss. Suddenly, he starts laughing like a madman, yelling that Kim shouldn't worry about that. Quickly, Rodney charges toward the rest of the henchmen. In the classroom, Seth hears the sounds of the chaos outside. The noise echoes through the room as well. Suspicious, he's eager to find out what's going on. Back to Kim, he prepares to counterattack. One of the men attempts to stab him, but Kim dodges and throws his knife into the man's arm. The thug ends up stuck and hanging from a locker. Moving swiftly, Kim grabs the man's knife. Charging forward, he delivers the final blow to the man's chest. Kim appears slightly fatigued from all the fighting. More henchmen arrive at the scene, and Kim starts to feel the pressure. A camera monitoring the situation catches a thug yelling or cursing. Suddenly, a blonde thug kicks Kim in the face, sending him crashing to the ground with a flying kick. In the classroom, Seth stands up, confusing his teacher. Sophie looks at the protagonist, curious about what's happening. As he heads for the door, he says nothing. Looking at the teacher, he tells her not to let anyone leave the room. With his hands in his pockets, he descends the stairs. Soon, he spots something. Someone is lying on the ground, defeated, and he realizes there's a fight going on. A group of men is surrounding his subordinate, Kim. Sweating, Kim is left with only a knife to defend himself. The newbie silently observes. However, as he glances to the side, he notices something useful. It's a fire extinguisher. The thugs are closing in on Kim with their weapons, but something catches Kim's attention. His boss is approaching from behind the thugs. Seth hits one of them with the fire extinguisher. The impact is so strong that it makes a loud noise. The thug slams his head into the lockers. After the hit, Seth seems thrilled. Nervous, the leader orders the henchmen to get the boy. Excited, they all charge toward the young man. Without a hint of fear, Seth faces the situation with a psychotic smile. Quickly, he opens the extinguisher, spraying it directly at the thugs coming at him. As they can't see anything, he takes advantage of the situation, throwing the extinguisher into the middle of the smoke. Excited, he decides to jump into the fog. With the smoke covering everything, he starts beating everyone down. Without anyone noticing, he slips out of the smoke, heading straight for the leader of the operation. Grabbing him by the head with force, he prepares to slam him to the ground with all his strength. It appears to be a total knockout. Seeing this, his subordinate Kim is shocked. Annoyed by the situation, the newbie sighs. He calls for the principal and the man dials the police, asking what the emergency is. He explains that the school is under attack by gangsters. He says the school building is full of mobsters. Panicking, he asks if they can come quickly. Hearing all this, the mobster stares at him. However, the police operator starts explaining, saying that due to the election ceremony, there aren't enough officers available. Continuing, the operator says they'll send the closest police agents as soon as possible. They hang up on the principal, who's left in shock, repeatedly saying hello. His trembling hand realizes he's in serious trouble now. Chip, the mobster, simply smiles at him. Suddenly, one of his subordinates calls out, announcing that they finally found the boy. This news makes Chip extremely happy, filled with excitement. Meanwhile, Seth has just defeated most of the henchmen. However, a few still remain. These remaining ones are nervous but ready to fight. Wanting to get out of this situation, the newbie asks if they have contacted his uncle yet. His subordinate responds that he hasn't answered yet but left a message. Hearing this, Seth becomes extremely nervous. Afraid, his subordinate apologizes profusely. However, Seth says that whatever happens, this seems to have gone way too far. The subordinate responds that his safety is the top priority at the moment. Hearing this, Seth remains silent for a moment. Changing the subject, he tells them to take this fight outside, and his subordinate agrees. Outside the school, Bob is handling things in his own way. A man approaches him from behind to attack. Without even needing to turn around, Bob strikes him. The man goes limp and falls to the ground as Bob says, "Time to go on a roaming run." He smashes another henchman's face, sending him flying as if he were a baseball. It seems like Bob has already defeated everyone with little effort. Opening his eyes, he notices something unusual. His boss, Seth, and Kim are fighting other henchmen along the way. Seeing this, the driver is shocked and surprised. Excited, he sees Kim smiling while their boss remains completely serious and silent. As they walk down the corridor, someone approaches the trio. It's Brock and Victor, who have also taken down all the henchmen in the gym. Annoyed, Seth tells them to stay out of this. Sweating, the blonde doesn't care much. Brock comments that it seems a little too late for that. This leaves the protagonist even more irritated. Walking through the school corridor, a new figure appears, questioning why all the boys are on the ground. He approaches the group of students, commenting that they seem careless. He notes that they're ruining the gang's reputation. Seeing this man, the newbie realizes it's Miduki Inosuke. He must be one of the 3 leaders of the 3-headed Phantom Gang, which is the largest gang in Japan. Seth asks what Inosuke wants. Excited, the mobster asks if Seth thinks he came to play. Inosuke declares that he needs to at least take the head of the Sunshine Group hair. Furious, Seth tells him to come and try. However, his subordinates step forward to protect him. At this, the Mafia leader calls for Kyle. He introduces Kyle as the #1 fighter in all of Japan. Kim and Bob prepare for a fight. Quickly, Kyle charges at them. He lands a punch on Rodney's face, confusing him. Simultaneously, he kicks Kim Kiyoshinga in the face. He manages to execute these moves with incredible speed, even surprising Seth Kang himself. In front of Yeonjinjin School, a police car approaches. It parks in front of the school. A police officer exits to assess the situation. He notes that nothing seems out of the ordinary and suggests they inform the station that everything is fine. He suggests they take a break. However, his partner notices something strange. He asks what it is. Surprised, his colleague asks what's happening. Quickly, he sees a bald henchman lying near the fence. Seeing this, he's taken aback. Sweating, he looks around. Soon, he sees multiple men lying on the ground. He is shocked while his partner asks again what's going on. Grabbing the police radio, he reports that they are at Yeonjinjin High School. However, he stops reporting when he hears a noise. Looking behind him, he notices something strange. A black plane has just arrived at the scene. The back door opens. 3 men emerge, with the one in the middle being the leader of the Anyang branch of the Sunshine Group. His name is David Lee, also known as White. Quickly, several vans arrive at the scene as well. Many people exit the vehicles, heading toward the officers. The 2 police officers become increasingly nervous. The man asks if they arrived first. Stuttering, the officer asks who he is. White doesn't respond, only staring at him. But more cars arrive, apparently to provide support. A man gets out of one of the cars and approaches. This is the leader of the Sumnam branch, also from the Sunshine Group. His name is Jonas Youngjin. He comments that White has already arrived. Smiling, he flashes his gold teeth. White says it's the first time the big brother has called them in years. Jonas adjusts his tie. With a murderous look, he glares at the police officers without saying a word. On the other end of the police radio, someone asks what's going on. They ask if backup is needed. It's too many people for just a few officers at this point. White asks his partner if he should go in first. The partner responds that they should contact the big brother first. One of them notes that almost everyone is already at the scene. The Sunshine Group's diverse members are ready to fight. On the phone, White is speaking with the big brother. He informs him that most of the team is already there and asks if they can proceed. This big brother is Uncle Jake, who tells them to wait as he's on his way. Uncle Jake is aboard a helicopter en route to the school. Back at the fight, where the driver and Kim took a beating, the best fighter in Japan approaches Seth. The 2 lock eyes. In the background, Seth's subordinates call the guy a bastard. The fighter looks back, giving him his attention. Irritated, they ask him who he thinks he is. However, their boss shouts their names. Startled by his shouting, they quiet down. Smiling, Seth tells them not to interfere. He's going to deal with this fighter now. The half-bald man prepares to fight. Excited, the newbie tells him to come at him. Quickly, the fighter's hand moves towards Seth without him even realizing. It's close, but Seth manages to dodge, only grazing his cheek. Realizing how fast he is, Seth's expression becomes serious as he repositions himself. Preparing for the next strike. The fighter tries another attack, but Seth dodges again. Despite trying various attacks, the fighter doesn't give up. Meanwhile, Seth continues to dodge, but with great difficulty. Surprised, Victor comments on how fast the man is. He wonders how Seth can avoid all those strikes. Brock watches the fight silently. Kim and Rodney, though beaten, aren't nervous because they trust their boss. In the classroom, the students watch the fight unfold. The teacher tells them to stop and get back to work. One student is recording everything while another says that the police are also on the scene. Annoyed, the teacher thinks these punks are a real handful. Suddenly, Sophie approaches the teacher, asking if she can join the group outside because she's worried about Seth. Confused, the teacher agrees. In the fight, Seth finally grabs his opponent's wrist, preparing for a counterstrike. His hand moves toward the fighter's face. Amazingly, the fighter dodges in a Matrix-style move as if referencing the iconic scene. Both of them back away at that moment. Seth touches his cheek, shocked by how close the hit was. He says, "This is going to be fun." The two stare at each other, preparing for another round. Suddenly, Seth charges toward the fighter. Excited, he smiles, telling them to bring it on. They approach each other quickly. Both prepare their punches. Both the fighter and Seth manage to dodge each other's attacks. Nervous, Seth notices his opponent's wrist approaching. In a moment of distraction, the fighter tries to land a kick. Seth ducks, evading the strike. Quickly, Seth prepares to throw a left punch, but the half-balled fighter dodges it as well. He gets ready to knee Seth in the gut. Reacting in time, Seth blocks the knee strike. The impact throws Seth back slightly. Confident, the fighter smiles. Excited, Seth smiles back, saying, "Now it's on." This statement leaves the half-bald man confused. Suddenly, they all hear something approaching. From the sky, Uncle Jake's helicopter arrives. It lands right in front of the school. This catches everyone's attention, including the mobster, who clearly knows who's coming. Someone starts to descend from the helicopter. That someone is Uncle Jake, arriving to assist. Several people begin moving as well. The area is now full of Sunshine Group subordinates. In shock, Victor asks what's happening. Uncle Jake steps ahead of the crowd. He bows to Seth, addressing him as Sir. Instantly, everyone present begins bowing as well. In the classroom, the students are confused. They ask what's going on and why everyone is bowing. The two police officers outside are also confused by the whole situation. Nearby, a group of Chinese gang members are on top of a building. But one with the ponytail asks his brother if it was Seth who defeated him. His brother confirms. Then the man asks if he thinks he can win if they fight again. His brother remains silent. Looking at his other partner, the ponytail guy comments that things have gotten a bit more complicated. He asks what they should do now. The man with sunglasses responds that there are too many Korean police officers around. He suggests they retreat for today as well. Smiling, he says he wants to see how everything turns out first, because it's gotten interesting. A voice suddenly interrupts, asking if it's really as fun as he says. Instantly, the three men turn around to see who it is. To their shock, it's Seth's mother standing in the middle of them. The man is stunned, realizing he hadn't noticed the woman's presence at all. With a terrifying aura, Seth's mother stares back at the Mafia leader. After everyone arrives to help, Kang tells them not to interfere. However, Uncle Jake starts to protest, but Seth insists that he needs to win this fight fairly. Jake falls silent after hearing his response. Two men watch the protagonist through the security cameras. They comment that everyone fell into the trap like rats. Irritated, one of them asks his subordinate if he thinks Seth will lose. Jake responds that this is not the kind of situation they're dealing with, urging him to look around. Numerous men are already lying defeated across the school grounds, and many are down near the buses as well. Seeing all of this, Kang remains silent. His subordinate approaches the boss, politely asking to leave the rest to him and to stop things from escalating further. He tells Seth that this fight is his own, asking if he understands that. After hearing this, Seth remains silent and watches. Facing the mafiosos, Seth apologizes for keeping them waiting. He asks them to continue from where they left off. The half-bald fighter says nothing and looks back, noticing the arrival of more people. Overjoyed, the Mafia leader orders him to finish off the boy. Obeying the command, the fighter charges towards Seth. Seth clenches his fists, preparing to fight. Quickly, the fighter closes in on Kang. Suddenly, a voice yells for everyone to stop. Both the hero and his opponent freeze at the shout. Everyone present is shocked by the voice. It's Seth's mother, who arrives, shaking up the scene. Everyone is left speechless by her appearance. The moment she arrives, the Mafia leader immediately falls silent. She looks at a security camera without saying a word. Then she turns her attention to her son's subordinate. She orders him to take care of anyone who's injured. Jake, confused by her command, questions her intent. She concludes by telling him to escort the rest of the people out of the school. Jake tries to protest, asking what she means by this. Impatient, she sighs. With a murderous aura, she asks when he started questioning her orders. Seeing this, Jake begins to tremble, visibly nervous. Three men approach the woman. One of them, named Ian, is her subordinate. She tells him to tend to anyone who is beaten in the fight. Ian quickly follows her command. Continuing, she instructs the others to leave the school and hold off the police for 5 minutes. Everyone follows her orders and starts moving. At that moment, Seth realizes that his mother is there. Looking at her son, the woman tells him she will let him fight. However, there's something she needs to say. Listening carefully, the protagonist pays full attention. His mother tells him that his position isn't something that ends with him alone. She explains that being a leader means carrying the burden of every fight, and that he cannot fight solely with his emotions. Hearing this, Seth is left in shock. Everyone begins leaving the area, following the woman's orders. As the half-bald fighter passes by her, she sternly says that Jacker hasn't caused any harm to her son, and for now, she'll let him go. Terrified, the man doesn't understand what she means. Suddenly, the Mafia leader and his henchmen approached, demanding to know who she thinks she is. He yells that he won't let some random person interfere in their business. He insults her. Knowing the man's full name, she gives him two options. The first is to gather all his people, get on the bus, and leave in silence. Hearing the first option, he immediately starts cursing at her. Without hesitation, she slices a part of his neck, while stepping on his henchmen with extreme ease. Seeing this, the man is in complete shock. The woman warns that if they interrupt her again, she will kill him. She asks if he understood. Everyone is stunned and frightened by her words. The Mafia leader is deeply irritated but stays silent, clearly afraid. After this, she begins explaining the second option, which is that the half-bald fighter and Seth will fight. Hearing this, Seth is surprised. Trembling, the Mafia leader doesn't understand what she means. She continues, stating that whoever wins gets whatever they want, or rather, whatever the people watching through the cameras want. Glancing at the cameras, the Mafia leader realizes she noticed them. Nervous, he says they have nothing to lose from this. Smiling, the woman tells him not to worry. As she turns away, she makes it clear that she always keeps her word. Seth, still confused about why his mother made such a bold decision, recalls her words about relinquishing his position if he fails to win. This weighs heavily on his mind. With a serious expression, he questions how disappointed his father would be to see the hair of the Sunshine Group lose to someone like this. Hearing this, the young hero smiles maliciously, declaring that he won't lose. Inside the school, Sophie and her teacher are descending the stairs. Suddenly, they notice something unusual. Looking down, they see a bald man lying on the floor and wonder what happened. They continue down the stairs. Reaching the lockers where students store their shoes, they encounter several people lying on the ground. Both become extremely nervous about the situation. Sophie pulls out her phone from her pocket. In an attempt to do something, she dials the police. However, the teacher explains that they already called the police and should return to class. But someone answers the call. Sophie recognizes the voice and asks if it's her father. He responds, asking why his daughter is calling at this time. She explains that something happened at the school, that the police haven't arrived. She mentions that some gangsters invaded the school, which makes her father very worried. Instantly, he responds, "Daddy's coming." Nervous, the teacher suggests they hurry back to class. At that moment, several people enter the school. Sophie notices the arrival of some men. One of them, who belongs to the Sunshine Group, notices her as well. They approach the two girls. Frightened, the teacher asks who he is. Confused, the man doesn't respond. He kneels near a body and checks for a pulse. Suddenly, he opens his jacket, revealing several medical tools stored inside. Taking out a scalpel, he says the person is still breathing. Nervous, Sophie can only think about her boss, Seth. Meanwhile, outside the school, the Sunshine Group's subordinates are securing the perimeter. Kang and his opponent stand face to face. All of their fellow fighters watch intently. From a distance, the Mafia leader yells Kaio's name, startling the half-bald man, who turns around. The leader orders him to destroy the boy. Kaio begins pulling something from his jacket pocket. It's a dagger, which he clearly intends to use in the fight. Seeing his opponent armed with a blade, Seth becomes furious. This also catches the attention of his mother, but she remains silent, merely watching. Kaio starts twirling the dagger in his hand. With a maniacal grin, he suggests they begin. Bob arrives at the scene, eager to speak with his boss. Handing over his strange weapon, Seth looks extremely excited. But Seth yells that he won't need that kind of thing. On the rooftop, the Chinese gang member asks his brother what they should do. The brother responds that for today, they don't stand a chance of doing anything. Watching the fight below, they both think about the Sunshine Group's power. Both fighters, Seth and Kaio, are ready and excited. They prepare for a direct clash. Seth is unarmed, while his opponent wields a dagger. Sometime later, at the school's assembly, the principal is addressing the entire student body. He welcomes the new students to the Yongjin Public Athletic School. Continuing his speech, he expresses hope that they can transition smoothly during their time at the school. Inside the school, students are chatting with one another. One of them is looking at something on his phone. Calling his friends over, he asks if they've seen this. One of them asks what he's talking about. The boy replies that it's the legendary school video. The video shows the fight between the protagonist and the half-bald man. In the video, Seth is landing a punch on his opponent's face, but at the same time, he's also getting slashed by the dagger. As they watch the fight, one student says it's fake, thinking Seth must be acting. Another student argues that it's 100% real, calling the first one an idiot. Quickly, more students join in, debating if it's 200 against 1, revealing a time skip. One of the students mentions that 2 years ago, Safe was the school's boss and took on the Japanese gang. Another student is skeptical, but the boy holding the phone yells that it's real. Suddenly, someone enters the classroom. Everyone turns to look at the person who opened the door. Introducing himself, the bald man says his name is J.K. Lee. He used to be the head of the school and says that donkey vloggers shouldn't believe in fake videos. However, someone else approaches. It's a man asking if Lee can step aside. Irritated, the bald man asks, "What did you just say?" The boy repeats his request, calmly asking the bald man to step aside. With a short temper, the bald man threatens, "You really want to die today, huh?" However, the boy remains silent. Another person arrives at the scene. It's a girl with short hair looking strikingly similar to Sophie but with subtle differences. She orders the bald man to leave immediately. Both the boy and the bald man are taken aback by the girl's presence. Frustrated, the bald man starts cursing, asking who she thinks she is to be giving orders. He prepares to strike. Quickly, she grabs her weapon while her companion gets ready to fight as well. She hits the bald man on the shoulder with her weapon, while her companion closes in and delivers a punch to his face. Together, they execute a perfect combo, leaving the bully stunned and terrified. Meanwhile, one of the students is still watching the video from 2 years ago. In the video, Kim also makes an appearance. He had helped the protagonist back then as well. It's clear from the footage how much Kim has changed during this time skip. His appearance has altered significantly, with his hair now cut short. Judging by the number on his uniform, it appears he's been in prison. However, today is the day of his release. Feeling relieved to finally be free, he notices a car waiting for him. It's his colleague Bob, the driver, smiling warmly. Bob calls him a bastard and gestures for him to come over. Kim walks toward the car, ready to leave. As the back door opens, Kim is shocked to see who's inside. It's the protagonist, now much older. Bowing respectfully, Kim's subordinate says, "The boss really came." Smiling, the protagonist replies that he came to pick up his precious friend and thanks him for everything he has done. Kim brushes it off, saying it was nothing and thanks the boss in return. The protagonist asks if Kim still wants to go to school. Back at Youngjin's school. Walking toward the school, the protagonist comments, "So, this is the place." He heads inside, remarking that the school seems fun. Meanwhile, in a distant location, a small bird flies through the forest, heading toward a dojo on the mountain. Inside the dojo, an old man kneels, holding some balls in his hands. Suddenly, he calls for Jin, who is sleeping while sitting upright. Hearing his name shouted repeatedly, Jin wakes up. The old man, already on his fourth yell, finally gets Jin's attention. Jin moves toward the elderly man, waiting for instructions. However, within seconds, Jin falls asleep while standing. At that moment, the sensei gets up and smacks Jin on the head with a wooden stick, calling him a brat. Reeling from the blow, Jin asks why the old man hit him. The elder responds, "Because I'm hungry." He continues calling Jin a brat and tries to hit him again. Confused, Jin doesn't understand why he's being punished, as he already finished chopping wood and filled the water buckets. Crossing his arms, Jin asks why he's being scolded when all of his chores are done. The old man falls silent but glares at him with a menacing look. Turning his back, the sensei tells Jin to pack his things. Shocked, Jin asks what he means. The old man reiterates that he should pack his things immediately. Still confused, Jin asks if he's being expelled. The sensei responds with another question, asking when Jin finished middle school. Counting on his fingers, Jin estimates it was about 2 years ago. The sensei says that Jin should at least try to finish high school. This revelation leaves Jin completely stunned. He asks for clarification, and the sensei explains that not only should Jin take the exam to skip ahead in high school, but he should also attend school. Jin, now speechless, remains silent. Sometime later, Jin heads to the city. He's amazed by the architecture of the place. Humming a tune as he skips along, he makes his way toward his new school. Soon he's impressed by the sight of it. Entering, he notices posters for the National Boxing Championship featuring Victor and also posters for the American Martial Arts League from the Chen group. Walking through the corridors, he heads toward classroom number 5. Inside, a man is writing on the blackboard, introducing himself as the new teacher. "My name is George Wu, and it's a pleasure to meet you all." He continues, explaining that as many know, the school has now become an athletic school. He's heard that there are a few aspiring athletes in the class. Asking those students to raise their hands, the 3 main students in the class do so. George acknowledges that sports are important but reminds them that they still need to focus on their studies. Just then, the boy from earlier appears at the door, curious about what's happening. The teacher looks at the new student and asks, "Who are you?" Embarrassed, the boy explains that he believes this is his class. Surprised, the teacher realizes it's the transfer student's first day. The boy then explains that as a transfer student, this is his first time attending school. He recalls his old man telling him that he should greet his teachers properly, and thus, it doesn't feel like just another school day for him. George, the teacher, walks toward him, stating that they need to check things thoroughly. He asks the boy to take his seat in the empty chair. Happily, the boy complies. As he looks around the classroom, he's a little surprised by everything. Introducing himself, he says his name is Jin and that this is his first time attending school. The class is shocked by this information, asking if it's really his first time. He confirms, explaining that he graduated by passing the exam to skip middle school. Hearing this, the students grow curious, while Jin smiles. He holds a piece of paper with something written on it. Glancing around to ensure he's in the right place, he heads toward a 2-story house. Confident that this is the right location, he rings the doorbell. The intercom grants him access. The door opens and he steps inside, spotting a woman. It's the protagonist's mother, who smiles and says, "You've arrived." The man is overjoyed to see his sister. She jokes that after all, he didn't get lost. With his arms crossed, he retorts that while he may have come from the forest, he's not stupid. His sister laughs. telling him he did well. She leads him inside as he removes his shoes. They calmly ascend the stairs. Curious, she asks how school was, and he responds that it was fun. Surprised, she says that's wonderful. When they reach the second floor, she opens the door to a room. She tells him that this will now be his room. Jin is amazed at the room his sister has given him. She explains that it used to be her son's room, though he lives elsewhere now but attends the same school. Jin is puzzled by this news. As she leaves, she tells him he'll see her son soon. Smiling, she suggests that he put his things away and follow her. In the house, there's a passage leading to a basement, resembling a secret cellar. As they walk down, it's quite dark, so she carries a candle for light. When they reach the bottom of the stairs, she asks him to wait. She lights additional candles to illuminate the area better. Seeing the room clearly, Jin is surprised. The basement is filled with various weapons. With a mischievous smile, his sister asks why they haven't tested her little brother's abilities yet. He doesn't understand what she means. Continuing, she asks him which weapon he'd like to use. Ignoring her question, Jin warns her that she'll hurt herself this way. Shocked, she stares at him. Jin explains that as the successor of their clan, he was taught from a young age never to lose. They lock eyes after this revelation. She responds with a laugh, saying that it looks like she won't be going easy on him. Meanwhile, back at school in a study room, the students are gathered around a large table. One student is missing. His close friend, Sophie Kim, who is now the student council president, is worried, feeling his absence. She explains to the gathered club leaders that she's called them together for one reason. Ham, the new captain of the Taekwondo club, says he's exhausted from training and suggests speeding things up. Paul Kwok, now the captain of the judo club, agrees, adding that the boxing and martial arts club captains aren't present either because they're busy with competitions. After these statements, a heavy silence fills the room. Nervous, Sophie doesn't say a word. Suddenly, the door opens. It's Victor Chu, now the president of the boxing club and the reigning IBF Asian champion. He walks toward the meeting table, drenched in sweat from what appears to be a training session. Apologizing for being late, he smiles. Sophie smiles back, saying it's fine and that the meeting has just started. Victor pulls up a chair to sit down. However, Sophie quickly asks what happened to Brock. Victor explains that Brock has a competition next week, so he's been training for it. Surprised, Sophie asks if it's a new competition. Victor confirms and then asks why they're having this meeting now. Sophie reminds him it's about recruiting freshmen who aren't involved in sports, questioning if he forgot about the freshman recruitment next week. Victor, a bit shocked, admits he did forget. Interrupting the conversation, Ham, the president of the Taekwondo club, yells out. Annoyed, he commands they stop chatting and get to the main topic. Seeing this outburst, Victor stays quiet. Sophie, the student council president, apologizes and says they'll begin now. She explains that the main point is that the principal asked for a favor, which is why they are all gathered. Before starting, she makes it clear that clubs are strictly forbidden from forcing freshmen to join. The second rule is that all clubs should avoid entering unnecessary competitions. Furthermore, if there are any tests or extremely intense training, it must be carefully considered. However, Sophie doesn't fully explain the third rule and the meeting ends shortly after. She tells everyone that's all for today. As she finishes packing up her materials, Victor remains seated silently at the table. Noticing his presence, Sophie asks if he's going to exercise. Victor replies that he is, but there's something he needs to ask first. He inquires if she's received any messages from that boy. Hearing the question, Sophie starts trembling, shaking her head as she says no. Victor then asks if she's heard anything about him returning to school. She replies that she hasn't seen him in a long time. Smiling, Victor tells her not to worry, reminding her that Seth promised his mother he would graduate. Nervous, Sophie recalls everything that's happened, particularly the terrifying memory of Seth's mother. She remembers how violently she was saved by Seth's mother. The memories of that event cause her to tremble more, breaking out in a nervous sweat. In the background, Victor notices her anxiety and asks if she's all right. She quickly responds that she's fine and hurriedly excuses herself, saying she'll leave first. Watching her leave, Victor sighs, sensing that something even stranger is going on with her. He begins to recall the final fight. He remembers when Seth saved Sophie from a gangster, ruthlessly beating the man. Stiff was in the middle of delivering a brutal beating to the leader, but his mother stopped him from finishing the job. Victor had witnessed everything personally. These memories are somewhat bitter for him. His expression hardens as he clenches his fist. Later that night, Jin is staying at Seth's mother's house. He stares at an egg in his hand. Meanwhile, the lady is washing the dishes. Looking at her brother, she asks if he didn't like the food. Rubbing the egg on his head, Jin responds that it's not bad. Curious, she asks why he isn't eating, and he explains that this is the first time anyone has ever cooked for him. Hearing this, she smiles. She tells him to get used to it because he no longer lives in the forest. Laughing, Jin agrees and thanks her for the meal. He takes some rice and seems to enjoy it a lot. Smiling, Seth's mother tells him to eat and grow stronger so they can fight again. However, Jin's reaction isn't entirely positive. He starts trembling. Amused, she asks if he doesn't want to. With a mouthful of food, he says he does, but there's a catch. He asks if she's okay with that. At this moment, she glances at the bruise on her arm, likely caused by their previous sparring session. Trembling slightly, she says she doesn't know how long it's been since she used her full strength. Jin falls silent after hearing this. Meanwhile, at Sophie's house, she arrives home from school and announces her return. Her father is sitting reading the newspaper and greets her. She comments on him being home early this time. Her father explains that it's election season and their company needs to behave appropriately during this time. Sophie then asks if he's had dinner. He replies that he has, as the maid prepared it for him. Sophie asks if he'd like some tea, and he says yes. Curious, her father asks how school is going and if it's been difficult. As she prepares the tea, Sophie says school is the same as always. Her father asks if she's decided what she wants to do in the future. Sophie admits that she's still unsure. Bothered, he asks if she's not interested in law anymore. Sophie respectfully replies that while she admires his work, she doesn't want to be busy all the time. Hearing this, her father begins to reflect. He apologizes for not taking better care of her. Sophie tries to clarify her earlier statement to her father, saying that she doesn't mean to upset him but wants to find something more enjoyable to do. Her response confuses her father. She then explains that she's currently interested in studying sports marketing. She mentions how incredible Brock and Victor seem becoming world champions at such a young age. Her father remains silent for a while, just listening. Continuing, she explains that ever since their school became an athletic school, many talented students have emerged, and when she sees their passion, it stirs something in her. Breaking the silence, her father asks if she's thought about the consequences. His stern expression makes Sophie feel uneasy. He then explains that the company where Victor and Brock are now is controlled by the Sunshine Group. Sophie remains silent, absorbing his words. Her father, opposed to the idea, firmly states that it's an absolute no. He tells her that he won't allow her to get close to that boy, referring to Seth. Shocked, Sophie listens as he continues, saying she can do anything else, but he won't risk her being in danger. Sophie stays quiet, lowering her head as her father's protective stance becomes clear. The next day at school, Jin is walking through the entrance, bruised and sporting a black eye and a swollen nose. He wonders what kind of teacher he has that left him so battered. Suddenly, he notices a crowd of students and asks what's going on. It's recruitment day for various school clubs. From football players to karate members, everyone is trying to recruit new students. Excited, Jin thinks to himself that this is going to be fun. Behind him, a tall student approaches and politely asks for some space. Jin greets him, saying, "Hey, you sit next to me, don't you?" Shy, the tall boy bends down and nervously says hello. Curious, Jin asks if the boy is part of any sports club, since he heard that everyone at the school has to pick at least one sport. Embarrassed, the boy admits he's an athlete from the class. Confused, Jin asks what being a class athlete means. Suddenly, a bald-headed student approaches, demanding they move out of the way, calling them trash. Both Jin and the tall boy are stunned by the insult. Annoyed, the bald student asks them again, "What are you looking at? Do you want to get beaten up?" Jin, wearing an innocent expression, doesn't seem to understand. Repeating himself, the bald student tells Jin to move and stop staring at him. The tall boy, nervous, swallows hard and stays silent, sweating. Trying to be friendly, Jin asks, "Are you in our class?" "Nice to meet you, friend." This infuriates the bald student, who feels disrespected by being called friend. He grabs Jin's shoulder and, cursing, asks, "Who said I'm your friend? You're gonna die." However, Jin still doesn't fully grasp what's happening and says nothing in response. Leaning into Jin's ear, the bald student demands that he follow him. After that, the bald guy starts walking away. The tall boy is left utterly confused, unsure of what just happened. Jin, however, simply watches him go and then follows. Later, the two of them find themselves alone in a deserted area of the school. With arrogance, the bald student asks, "Do you know who I am?" Innocently, Jin replies, "Yeah, you're in my class. I saw you yesterday." Enraged, the bald student calls Jin a bastard. Confused, Jin doesn't understand why he's being insulted. Lighting a cigarette, the bald guy introduces himself as Jack Lee, the boss of the school here in Dong. He asks Jin if he's ever heard of him. Sincerely, Jin responds, "No, I haven't." Raising his eyebrows, Jack can't believe what Jin just said. Then Jin quickly reaches over and snatches the cigarette from Jack's mouth. Seeing this, Jack becomes furious. Smiling, Jin innocently says students shouldn't smoke. Jack, now on the verge of exploding, readies himself to punch Jin. He lunges at Jin, who remains perfectly calm. Jack throws a right-hand punch, but Jin effortlessly drops the cigarette and prepares to counter. Using just 2 fingers, Jin blocks Jack's punch, leaving the bully stunned that his fists couldn't make contact. Calmly, Jin says students shouldn't hit their friends while immobilizing Jack's punch. He then grabs Jack by his jacket, holding him in place. Extremely irritated, Jack starts cursing furiously. Suddenly, someone yells for them to stop. Both Jin and Jack turn around to see who it is. It's Henry Chang, the school's student council president. He calls out to them, accusing them of being bullies. Jin, puzzled, questions if he's really a bully because, in his mind, a bully is something entirely different from what he is. Desperate to clarify, Jin says, "I'm not a bully." Henry introduces himself, saying he's Henry Chang, the student representative of the school. Henry Chang, standing with authority, tells them that being around ensures they follow the school rules. He adds that he's also the head of the wrestling club, boasting that he placed 5th in the winter competition. He He insists they shouldn't underestimate him just because he came in 5th, explaining that he only started wrestling last year. This leaves Jin even more confused. Henry then reveals that he's also the younger brother of the famous Brock Chang, which immediately intimidates the bald student. With a superior attitude, Henry asks the freshman if they understand now. The bald student lowers his head, admitting that he barely knew who Henry was. Watching all of this unfold, Jin is left completely baffled by the situation, especially since it's his first time at school. As Henry looks at Jin, he criticizes his bad attitude and instructs him to visit the student council room during recess. Pointing to himself, Jin asks if Henry is talking to him. Without responding further, Henry turns and leaves, the bald student following him, both laughing together. Curious, Jin wonders if this is what they call social life. Turning to the tall student, Jin asks if he was worried about him, smiling and saying, "You're a nice guy." Sometime later, at the J. Fox Boxing Academy's main building, Brock is training tirelessly. The academy's director is observing his practice. At the same time, Akira, the executive secretary of the Sunshine Group, arrives at the academy. Seeing him, both Brock and the director become curious. The director asks what brings Akira there. Akira explains that the president wanted to know if Brock could stop by. The suggestion shocks the director, who reminds him that the competition is just days away. However, Brock responds calmly, saying it's fine, and asks Akira to tell the president that he's ready.